Welcome, everybody. Thank you for being here. This is the second part of the Integrating Critical and Computational Analysis to Understand Collective Social Construction workshop and the Methods in Social Change and Inertia series. I'd like to thank the British Academy, Talent Development Award for funding the series and the support that we've gotten from the University of Greenwich Institute for Life Force Development and Center for Inequalities. These are not normal times and we can't let them feel as if they were. So before we begin, as usual for every event in the series, we'll take a moment's silence in solidarity with all the people who genocide and ecocide across the globe. Thank you. So today's speaker is Dr. Joshua Uyheng, Assistant Professor at the Department of Psychology at Ateneo Manila University, where he directs the Political Psychology of Democratization Lab. His research examines social narratives and networks in the context of political and technological change, especially in the global south. He's also interested in critical, translational, and mixed methods approaches to computational social science. Thank you so much, Josh, for volunteering your time and here to show us what you do. Today, Josh will lead us on some practical exercises showing some of the ways we can conduct computational analyses in more critical ways. Just a reminder that online attendees can type questions in the Q&A or chat throughout the session. I'll also call on people if they raise hands to ask questions on screen during the Q&A or practice periods. And online, we have automated captioning in multiple languages. If you're more comfortable in a language other than English, just turn on the captions and change the language setting at the top right of the captions bar to your preferred language if it's available. The session will be recorded and uploaded to YouTube and our archives. I'll provide the links at the end. But without further ado, the floor is for Josh. Thank you.
Which mouse. And so, thanks again, Fouad, for the invitation, and thank you everyone both here physically and virtually. We'll just get right into it with a quick review of the stuff that we discussed yesterday. Knowing that, acknowledging that today is intended to have a few hands-on components. Everyone, both here and virtually, is invited to try them out. But of course, I do want to still kind of embed what we're about to do on a practical level within the conceptual foundation. So just to kind of revisit what we discussed yesterday, we talked about what collective social construction is. So that's a particular area of research that we've been trying to apply these computational methods in a critical way to. So what are critical and computational analysis? I hope that yesterday's discussion was able to open up starting points for thinking about those two things, and in particular, how they're integrated to target this area of research. Okay, so just as we discussed yesterday, social construction looks at meaning, and in particular, the making of meaning as something that is contingent and processual. And then as something that is social as well, meaning is something that is made not alone, but in the real, implied, and imagined presence of others, as well as not in isolation, but in context. And because we think about meaning as social and constructed, we can also think about it as collective. So if we take seriously the assertions that social construction takes place in communication, in community, and in context, then maybe, as much as we recognize that social construction is fluid and agentic, it may also be constrained because we're talking to other people, we're talking to people within and between groups, we're situated within these larger social, political, economic, cultural contexts. So we can't just say anything at any time, right? We say things in relation and in context. Okay. And if we do consider social construction to be this sort of constraint thing, then that becomes our sort of methodological starting point for using or for thinking about computational methods to study those processes, right? So yesterday we discussed two broad categories of computational methods: classification methods, which help us identify data with predefined labels, and clustering, which identifies latent patterns in the data for the quote-unquote labels to then be identified a little bit more interpretatively, and looking at the specific things that are being grouped together. Some of the particular models that are common in these broad categories. So there's regression models, neural networks. In the classification side and on the clustering side, we're able to group together things that are in network form or in topic form. And then there are some reasons why classification and clustering are not straightforward to apply to questions of collective social construction. But as I hope to show today, and as I kind of discussed already yesterday, there are openings, right, for being able to do that with intention and with a critical orientation. Okay. It's us. Okay. All right. And so the approach that we try to take resists what we've been calling an assimilative view of just using big data and computational methods to do psychology as quote unquote as usual, right? So we try to resist tendencies within these methods to reproduce a generic view of humanity that are unfruitful, that are unfruitfully silent on the power-laden relationships in any kind of analytical process, and the production of knowledge that merely reaffirms and extends social control. So we adopt an ontology that emphasizes collective meanings, local interpretations, and reflexivities from. So in particular, when we think about the different features of the methodological design, we try to think kind of heuristically that the quantitative parts of what we're about to do are meant to apprehend those constraining social structures of meaning, right? So if collective social construction is understood to feature these sorts of regularities because of whatever structural constraints or relational constraints are present, then maybe quantitative methods are able to capture those regularities. But if we also assume that because it's still a process of social construction, it's still fluid, it's still agentic, then we're able to incorporate qualitative methods within these frameworks as well. But because it's essentially a mixed methodological framework, we also want to emphasize that the criticality is not just limited to the qualitative part, but there are also ways to embed critical principles in both components. And as a result, the insight is intended to emerge at the nexus of both components, right? So we don't just say, I will be uncritical for the quantitative stuff so that I can be critical later on. The critical stuff happens across every step of the methodology. Okay, so the way I've intended to organize day 2 is that in the morning, we will try to take a look at classification models for looking at collective social construction. And in the afternoon, we will try to look at clustering models. So I was telling Fouad earlier that depending on how much time we want to spend on the hands-on session, there's quite a few degrees of freedom for how long the sessions will actually take. So we're kind of just going into it and then seeing how how the interactions will unfold. So those for participants that are online, please feel free to follow along, and then I will do my best to be able to address any bugs that come up. But I did stress test the code to make sure that ideally things are still working, and then we can just kind of discuss what is coming out on our screens, right? So no software downloads are necessary, but we'll talk about it when it comes up, right? So before we actually get to the hands-on, I also just wanted to talk about a few specific examples of how these methods have been used in some of our past work. So some of them actually precede me. So I think Tina is in the audience, so Tina will see some of the early 2017 era work that tries to put these principles together. So for this morning, classification models for collective social construction. So as a review, what is a classification model? You start with a bunch of data, you learn a mathematical relationship that takes you from the data to a set of predefined labels. And essentially, you're just learning this mapping from it's either text or other kinds of psychological measures to some label of interest. And we try to talk about, is it even possible to do this in a way that helps us understand collective social construction? We have made valiant attempts in the past, and I think Fouad was the one who brought this up, that different steps of this methodological pipeline may actually be open to the incorporation of critical principles. So if you're just a pure computational scientist, you're probably going to think, oh, yeah, these are the steps that I would take to use a classification model. I would obtain the data. If the data is not already labeled, I would probably try to label the data. Then I would look through all these different models that are available. So things like logistic regression, random forest models, neural network models, maybe an LLM. I will train those models. I will evaluate how accurate they are. I will maybe deploy them to classify a bigger data set, and then let's interpret what's going on, right? So this is what a computational scientist is going to think about when they're thinking about using classification models. And so the way we've been trying to use these models in our own research into questions of collective social construction has been to think about these steps not as not as fixed sort of crystallized methodological steps, but things that are open to critical intervention. So the first study that I want to talk about is actually something that I alluded to yesterday. It was published in 2019, and it was this study of dehumanization in the online discourse that erupted following what we in the Philippines refer to as the Mama Sapano massacre. So in 2015, there was this huge shootout between the Philippine government forces associated with the Christian majority and members of the Muslim Liberation Front in the southern islands of the Philippines. There are many conflicting reports about casualties on both sides, but the sort of conservative official estimate is around 50 in total. And what we were interested in particular in was how heightened religious tensions became a feature of public discourse. And in particular, people were, dehumanizing each other across intergroup lines, and we wanted to study that, right? So at this point, we were turning to online talk as a way of kind of seeing how people were actually engaging in this conflict situation. In their everyday lives. And one of the really important features of the way this study was conducted was because there's no word for humanization or dehumanization within the language, within Filipino. The way this study unfolded was to use manual labels, right? So I think sometimes if you want to train a computational classifier, but there's no existing pre-labeled data set, you're going to try to do the labeling. If you're a pure computational scientist and you're not really thinking about these questions of social construction, maybe you will ask random people on a crowdsourcing platform to assign the labels. Like you will go on Amazon or you will go on Crowdflower, and then you will try to get like 100 crowd workers to try to do this task. In the age of LLMs, you might also try to do the same thing. Like you're going to try to conceptually define dehumanization and then say, okay, here's a bunch of Facebook comments. GPT try to identify humanization, dehumanization, right? But we were starting from this, this theoretical commitment that dehumanization is also something that is socially constructed. Yes, there may be an official conceptual definition, but where you are within the social structure will also shape your sensitivity to those kinds of discursive acts. And so the way that this study unfolded was there was a Christian annotator and a Muslim annotator representing the two groups that were in conflict in this situation. And one of the really interesting things that came out was that there was no reliability essentially in the traditional quantitative sense. No, so where the Christian tended to see neutral statements and non-dehumanizing statements, the Muslim annotator was much more sensitive. And so in a computational, through a standard computational framework, you would see this as a weakness. You would see this as a flaw in the method that, okay, nobody's agreeing. Maybe there's no way to build a reliable classifier if humans themselves cannot agree, or maybe the concept is just not stable enough, right, to apply computational modeling to. But one of the really important sort of pivots within this study was to then frame that not as a flaw or not as a sort of not as something that would make the study like invalid, but it became a new source of questions, right? So why was there so much disagreement? What was the source of that sort of difference in perspective? And that became a new question for the study. So there's one kind of emergent section within the paper where the texts, where the Christian coder and the Muslim coder were not seeing the same thing, where the text became subjected to analysis. So here on the left, you're seeing the texts where the Christian did not see any humanizing or dehumanizing, but the Muslim coder saw dehumanization. And then here you're seeing where the Christian coder saw nothing again, but the Muslim was saying, nope, this is dehumanizing Muslims. And here was a very strong area of disagreement, because the Christian coder was actually saying this is humanizing Muslims, where the Muslim coder said it was dehumanizing them. And so when the words that were within these three categories were computed, we were able to see within this paper that, okay, for example, here in this bottom right, Islam does not promote violence, but we Muslims are always blamed, although not all of us are terrorists. And even if the MILF, which is the Moro Islamic Liberation Front, are not just the ones who fall, right? So here, the Christian is saying, maybe this is humanizing Muslims because it's drawing this sort of separation between the religion and the people, right? Like, but for the Muslim coder, actually no, this is this is dehumanizing, because we don't want to draw that separation. So it's the assertion of violence, not the fusion of the people with the religion, that is considered to be dehumanizing, right? So yeah, so that's one example. So this is just intervening into that early portion of the classification pipeline, and I want to show you other examples which kind of go further down. So here is another study that we did where we were looking at textbooks that talk about martial law in the Philippines. So this is a very controversial, it shouldn't be, but it's a very controversial part of our history, because we had this essentially a 20-year dictatorship in the 70s and the 80s. And currently, the president that we have right now is the son of that dictator, which is kind of illustrative of how, like, broadly as a public, the way that we think about martial law has been fairly contested. We haven't really gotten to a point where, as a public, we all understand or we all see that that era of state violence and repression in the same way. And we, in particular, wanted to look at how textbooks as a site of that sort of collective social construction might play a role in that sort of creation of contested memories, right? So what we did here was we actually did more text classification by actually we went to the education ministry, the national office. We were like, okay, we would like to see every single textbook that is currently in use across all the year levels in basic education, and where are the chapters that talk about this era. And so we had this big text corpus that is not very standard, right? Like, because we just really saw all these different textbooks, and then we were also seeing that the ministry gave us materials for like technical education, vocational education. So we had all this stuff. And then we did this sort of manual labeling process again, so that we could train classifiers and understand what was really going on, right? When talking about this martial law period. For us, because it was textbooks, textbook materials, we had a hard time thinking about what would be the unit of analysis. So, for example, in a social media data set, maybe a unit of analysis is a comment or a tweet. Here, it's like, it can't really be the book itself because there weren't that many textbooks. Maybe it's not necessarily a chapter because not everything is in chapters. Sort of as a middle ground, we decided, okay, we will look at paragraphs. So thinking that maybe paragraphs make sense as a unit of analysis because there is some intention in breaking up this historical material into these sorts of groups of 5 or so sentences. So we went through every single paragraph of all of this textbook material, and we decided, okay, because it's so contested, let's do very, very simple classifications, right? Is this paragraph, for instance, talking about certain contributions of the era, or about corruption? So contributions and corruption was like the first thing. We also had a label that said neither, so that's why this doesn't add up to 100%, right? But just from that standpoint, we were able to see that, okay, more than 20% of the paragraphs talking about martial law or the Marcos presidency are talking about its contributions. So what were the laws that it enacted? What were the buildings that were created? What were the what were the arts that were patronized, for instance? And all this stuff, about 15% of the paragraphs were the ones talking about human rights violations, about monopolies over different parts of the economy, things like that. So we were thinking, okay, that in itself is already very interesting. Let's look at this other thing that the education literature was talking about, which is the use of objective and subjective tone in talking about history, right? So certain things are positive, other things are negative. So, for example, if I'm talking about a contribution, generally I'm talking in a positive way. If I'm talking about corruption, generally that's something in a negative way. But this other dimension of the talk, which was objective and subjective, was something that we found was really, really interesting, because even though it was a history textbook, there were certain paragraphs which were framed in an objective way. Like, for example, 50% of this economy was this and that, right? But there were also many subjective statements which were saying things like, many people believed that this was a violation of human rights, right? So something like that. And then when we did the classification and did the usual, let's cross those two sets of categories, we noticed that, okay, if something positive was being talked about, generally, so when something took on an objective tone, we were seeing, okay, generally it's referring to positive features of the martial law era. And then when it was taking a subjective tone, it was more negative. So this became like a really, like for us at the time, we were really reeling from this finding, because we were seeing not only are the textbooks emphasizing the contributions of the period, but at the same time, whenever negative features of the regime were being talked about, it was always like, yeah, but it's like some people's opinion, right? So that became a really interesting part of this analysis. Yeah, and then finally, this is where I guess the most sort of like computing really took place. Was we eventually were able to train this classifier that would distinguish between paragraphs that talked about supporters of the regime and its opposition. And what we found was, so here are all these words that are the top distinguishers between opposition text and support text, right? So if the score is moving to the right, that means these are the words associated with paragraphs talking about opposition to martial law. And if it's here on the left, these are words which predict that it's about supporters or positive things about martial law. What we thought was really, really striking was that the number one word that predicted that something was about the opposition was Aquino, who was essentially the next president, right? Of following the fall of the dictatorship. But this was telling us that throughout all of this talk about opposition to martial law, it wasn't really framed in terms of like, say, so the social movement against it, the activism that was against it. It was really latching on to the next person that became president. And for many, this became this sort of way to criticize the democracy that came after, that it's another elite. It's someone that, kind of ironically was also like related to one of the dictator's many cronies. So this became an area of sort of vulnerability in thinking about the memory of opposition to martial law, because it was primarily associated with a member of the elite, right? Later on, we were seeing that the other terms that were related to opposition to martial law were things like revolt, what is that? Revolt, revolution. So that's, I mean, depending on where you sit in the political spectrum, you may see that word as positive. You may also see that word as kind of negative, especially when you flip to this other side, which is talking about support or support for martial law, right? Because now, if the opposition is about this elite figure and revolt and revolution, then here's what it means to actually support the regime. Things like law and order, service, change. So that was also the language that the dictator was using in order to justify the beginnings of martial law. That I'm going to create a new society, and in order to do that, I need all of this power, right? So even in a textbook, that is written and that is meant to be studied under the democratic conditions following martial law, there's this sort of framing of support and opposition to the regime that kind of renders it very fragile, I would say. That even though, yes, we're going to acknowledge that, this was an authoritarian regime, it was fundamentally about law and order and peace, even, I think it's peace. Yeah. Yeah, peace, peace, law, order, and service to the people. Whereas the opposition was associated with, a particular political figure and these sort of maybe controversial concepts of revolt and revolution. So, yeah, so here were some of the texts that we found were quite illustrative of those dynamics. So here on the left, right, it's talking about opposition in terms of the Aquino. So with Ninoy's death, so Ninoy was one of the prominent opposition figures to the dictatorship, the spirit of EDSA emerged. So EDSA was what we called the sort of big collective movement that eventually led to the toppling of the dictatorship. So over 1 million people gathered on this road called EDSA and ousted the dictator, right? So the nation mourned him. His widowed housewife, Corazantino, known as Cory, led many rallies and the people listened to her. Thousands came from different walks of life to march with them, unafraid of the military. As they called for justice for Ninoy, they also called for Marcos to step down and for the return of democracy. So of course, I mean, seen in isolation, that's good. This is true. These are things that really did happen. But because they are the sort of central node of emphasis for talking about the opposition to martial law, one wouldn't be faulted for thinking that, okay, we got rid of this dictatorship, but primarily in relation to these opposition figures. It wasn't like freedom or rights or that sort of thing. It was calling for justice for this central elite political figure. Meanwhile, here on the right, faced with the intensifying protest against the government, President Marcos was still thinking about how he could strengthen the government, keep the economy from failing, and restore the trust of the whole world in his administration. So this is not even veiled anymore, but this is right in our textbooks, which kind of paint the dictator as a sort of benevolent but possibly misunderstood figure. You see associated with economy, with still trying to gain people's trust and all of that. And so these are the more qualitative extracts which reflect these sort of dynamics which we were able to extract quantitatively. Okay. So that's the history. So this is the last example I want to talk about before we move on to the hands-on portion. And this is not far history anymore, but recent history, where we were taking a look at speeches that state leaders were making during the pandemic, right? So we know that leadership was really emphasized as this hugely important social psychological factor for improving national responses to the pandemic. But one of our arguments was that this is not something that is equal or comparable across countries with different economic resources, right? And so viewed through that lens of collective social construction, if you're a wealthy country, you probably have access to more material resources. And that also shapes the kinds of symbolic resources that you're able to invoke when you're saying, okay, everybody socially distance. You cannot really say that in a country that is primarily these dense urban poor communities where there's 10 people in a house, and the next house is like sharing, like a very thin wall or things like that, right? So we were really arguing about these sorts of economic constraints to the sorts of symbolic actions that leaders could take. And one of the ways that we wanted to study that was by looking at their speeches. And here is a nice figure, and I will try to talk through what is on here. So we took a look at all of the words that were in these speeches by members, the leaders of high income and upper middle income countries, and then low and lower middle income countries. So we put all of those words on this two-dimensional plot where the x-axis is the use of those words by low middle income countries, and the y-axis is high income countries. So in general, all of the words kind of feature positive correlation, and that just makes sense because just people are tending to use similar words. Like maybe if it's like grammar words like is and are and all of that, right? But one of what was really interesting was when we were starting to look at the words that pointed to the divergences. So if this is the line that marks that positive correlation, which is 0.4, you're seeing that some of the words are above the line and some of the words are below the line. If they're above the line, that means they're disproportionately used by leaders of higher income countries, right? Because on average, it's higher up here on the y-axis relative to where you would expect on the x. And then if it's below the line, these are the words that are used more disproportionately by leaders in poorer countries. So the most important word that I wanted to emphasize here is don't, because it's like the furthest here on the bottom right. And this is really telling you that in general, in wealthier countries, the COVID speeches were really about these sorts of measures and interventions. So here we have measures, economy, cooperation, like emergency decisions. So it was very like sort of this like technocratic, we've got systems in place, right? And here on the bottom and on the right, so meaning below the line, the trend line, the main thing is don't. So it's really intended to restrict the actions of the citizens, to restrict certain movements, right? And you actually see in relation to the don't, we also see police, lockdown. Those are words more associated in poorer countries. I think there was also military here, things like that, right? So that this figure on its own was really interesting to us, because it was already quite illustrative of the high level differences. And this is where I want to show one of the ways that we used a classification model, not in the usual sense, right? Because usually you would say accuracy in F1, as much as possible, let's make them high, right? Because that tells you that the classifier is good. But we were also interested in when is it not good necessarily, not the best classifier, but how well would it still perform, right? So we have here on this figure, this is the general trend line. Then there are these two broken lines which tell you like one standard deviation on the x and on the y. So when we use the entire vocabulary, this was as good as the model could kind of get in distinguishing whether the speech came from a richer country or a poorer country. So this is pretty good. If you only use the words that are beyond the broken lines, actually the performance doesn't go down that much, right? So they're actually some of the most informative words. So if you ignore everything that's here and just look at those words, then you're still able to sort out, like I'm going to look at a speech. I don't know who it's from, but I see the words that are being used. Generally, I will be able to see that, okay, yeah, I could still perform pretty well in classifying if it's from a richer or a poor country. But what we thought was really funny was, well, not really funny, but we thought this was really informative, where if we trained a classifier using a single feature, the word don't, you could actually get 90% accurate classifications. The F1 drops by a lot because that's telling you that it's not like in general it'll be a biased model. But it's still quite informative, meaning if I don't know, if I don't see any other word, like let's look at all these speeches, erase every word, and all you're seeing is a collection of don'ts. It actually already tells you that, yeah, more likely than not, I will be able to know whether this was from a richer country or a poorer country. So this was like our creative use of the prediction model stuff, no? We actually also opened up under the hood of one of those classification models. So this is what's known as the decision tree. So I wanted to show this because it's another common at the time. It was another common machine learning classification model that is able to capture nonlinear relationships, right? So it's not like a logistic regression. And what it does is it's able to look at specific words that are present or absent within a speech, and then sort of prune or sort of split the data set up into these different categories. So if we have a bunch of words here, they're going to split the data set into if it comes from a lower middle income country or an upper high income country. And I want to walk through the thinking, quote unquote, of the model here. So the first, like where it starts here at the top is the word friends, which we thought was a really interesting place to begin. But if the speech mentions friends more than 2.8 times, this is what the model was able to see statistically, then it tended to be a speech from lower middle income countries. So the leaders of poorer countries were talking about friends more. So like their regional allies, or sometimes their dependence on like China or the US, or these big countries that were donating like vaccines and other sorts of public health resources. So okay, so if it's friends, I will predict lower middle income countries. If it doesn't use friends as much, I won't make a decision yet, but then I will look at the next word, which is money, right? And then if I mention money, oops, okay, it's lower middle income country again. So if I mention friends, the model is saying, okay, this is from a poorer country. If I don't mention friends but money, okay, it's lower middle income country again. So when the speech is talking a lot about money, it's from a poorer country as well. Okay, and then next, okay, let's say I don't mention money, I will now mention nation. So nation is interesting because it doesn't give you a classification right away. Instead, if it does mention nation a lot, it will then look at a different word, which is open. And open, so if I don't say friends, I don't say money, but I say nation, and then I say open, so open nation, it's actually from a wealthier country. But if I don't use open, then it's from a poorer country. So poorer countries are interested in friends, money, and closed nations, right? So whereas invocations of nation with open tend to shift towards the upper high income countries. Later on, these are more complicated, like decisions that the tree is making. But let's say it doesn't say any of these words, but then it says possible. Once it's the word possible, it goes to upper high. So it's richer countries that are talking about this is possible, we could do it, right? If it doesn't say possible, it will then look at secretary. For some reason, secretaries are the ones that are mentioned by lower middle income countries, and so on and so forth. So this is one of the ways that you're able to look under the hood of what a classification model is doing. We didn't actually include this in the main text of the paper, but we included it in our very long supplementary material, just to show that the classification model was kind of reasoning in a way that wouldn't really make sense. I think if we were to write this paper again with like LLMs and all of that, we might try something else that incorporates those technologies in order to see the reasoning as well. But yeah, at least in terms of a relatively more simple statistical model, this is how it will work, right? Okay, so there are some more traditional applications that we've been able to do in the past. So what I mean by traditional applications is something that a computer scientist would say, yeah, this is how you could use text analysis classification methods to do social science research. So here is a study that I did where we actually, we classified tweets that were geolocated as being, as whether or not they included hate speech. And one of the really interesting things was when you do the sort of more traditional statistical analysis with the amount of online hate as a variable, you can actually see whether it relates to hate crimes during the pandemic and whether those are are controlled by things like whether the state was a Republican state or a Democratic state. So this was in the context of the pandemic where we were seeing that there was a lot of anti-Asian hate. It was coinciding with the anti-Black movements, and we wanted to know, does online hate signal that a place is about to see more hate crimes taking place? And does the reverse also occur? Meaning, when hate crimes are taking place, does it seem to legitimize more collective hateful sentiments against marginalized groups? And essentially, the headline finding was that online hate would predict hate crimes, not very significantly, but I mean, not by a huge effect size, but it was statistically linked to future commission of hate crime, but the opposite was not necessarily true. So when there were more hate crimes in a certain place, it didn't necessarily mean that there would be larger amounts of hate there, right? But in general, we were seeing that COVID infections were predictors of hate crimes. So these sorts of like material conditions, like a place is experiencing more strain from having more of the disease, as well as there's more online hate in the digital space. It seems like it's an important like cultural signal that the social divisions are being emphasized more. Violent words are becoming seen as more legitimate, and so violent actions kind of follow that sort of thing. Another one, I think it's stuck. Let me see. It's not moving. Oh, there. Okay. I think there's a lag, which is good. Okay, there. So another study that we did still with COVID was we were also looking at we were also able to classify the texts as being pro-mask or anti-mask, right? And we were seeing whether that would predict actual masking behavior and in turn predicting future infection in relation to these sorts of big policy measures of having mask mandates and all of that. And I think one of the big headline findings was really that in general, mask mandates do increase masking behavior as they should, and they also reduce future infections, which is also great, right? So if I have a mask mandate, this offline stuff will affect the offline outcomes, which is good. But when you link it to this sort of text data, which we were finding online, we were seeing that when a mask mandate gets implemented, it actually also increases the anti-mask sentiment online, right? So people are like, oh, you're forcing us to wear masks. Now I don't like masks. And we found that it was producing a negative effect on the behavioral outcomes of actually wearing masks and eventually infections actually taking place. So it was sort of like from a more traditional statistical standpoint, it was like a reduction of the overall total effect of the mask mandates on the public health outcomes by inducing the sort of greater controversy in the online space. So that, I would say, these are two of the more traditional applications of classification methods for text. And it is something that we are also able to do, right? Once you have a text classifier, you can apply it downstream and you do all of this usual statistical modeling. So for hate and hate crimes and anti-mask and mask wearing. So yeah, there seems to be a 5-second delay. That's okay. Good. Okay. All right. So so some key considerations before we finally jump into the hands-on stuff. Classification is a computational technique for sorting texts into predefined categories. But if you're adopting this sort of collective social construction standpoint, you can actually intervene in these more traditional parts of the methodology, to reflect that more critical orientation. So it can be at the level of data collection and labeling, as we showed with that study of dehumanization. It can be on the level of looking at model performance measures, as well as interpreting what the model is doing kind of in terms of its coefficients and the statistical relationships that it's learning. Okay, so now time to try. Like I said, there's a lot of degrees of freedom for the amount of time that we're going to dedicate to this. So let's just let's just take it as it goes. So here's a short link that you can type into your computer browser. I don't know why I put a QR code because I guess if you were scanning it with your phone. Yeah, but here's like the short link if you want to try. So people online are also welcome to type this link onto their browser.
Oh, we take 5 minutes.
Oh yeah, okay, sorry, yes. So as Fouad's suggestion, let's take a short break. Yeah.
Yeah, so just 5 minutes, everybody, and then we'll come back to and start this.
Yes, thank you.
Just so you have time to.
So everyone please try to input the link. So it's bit.ly/3 capital JLV and small n and then capital JC. I'll just keep that up here for now. What this will take you to should be a Google Drive folder with a couple of CSV text data sets and a bunch of code that you should be able to run directly on your browser, right? So you don't need to download anything. This should be something you can, just open and start running, right? Okay, so if there are no more issues with so what I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna, yeah, I'll just chat that link. Is that okay?
You can also switch the sharing to the browser if you.
Yes. So I want to share the link so that I can do that. Here. Right. So yeah, this works. So I think if you're not me, I don't think you would be able to edit these files directly, right? So maybe you can create a copy on your own Google Drive if that's all right. So you can just like right click. Let's start with the classification file and then right click and make a copy. And then once you are able to make a copy, I think that should be something you're able to use directly. I think. Yeah. Did it work? Yeah. Okay. Great. So that copied file, if you double click on it, you should be able to open and see that this is what the code looks like. Before we start running anything, I just want to sort of take you on a tour of what's going on here, right? So all of this is a bunch of R code. I think the previous speaker used Python. Oh, you're able to edit yourself. Okay. Please don't for now. Yeah. But yeah, I should figure that out. I don't know why that's happening, but anyway, just so we can move forward now. The first block is a bunch of libraries that are going to be installed in order to run stuff. So anything on the browser is actually just base R, which is the programming language. And so there are a couple of things that need to be installed, but it won't be installed on your computer. It'll just be installed on this instance of the R code, right? Okay, so this is installing the packages. This one will be reading the data that is in here. So for the classification stuff, I want to take a look at the data of speeches that were delivered during these debates around reproductive health bill in Philippines. We'll be reading that data in. This next block is really just cleaning that data, and then it will be converting the clean data into what is known as a document term matrix. So a document term matrix is like we'll see what it looks like when we start running the code. But it is kind of the version of the data that converts from the unstructured text, so meaning the speeches themselves, into something that a machine is able to understand. So if you were here for the previous speaker, this would be the most basic version of the data representation, and you can totally switch this up with the more advanced representation. So word embeddings or TF-IDF. This one is really just the most basic. From there, we do a sort of basic word counting code, and then we train a classifier, we evaluate the classifier, And then we take a look at what are the words that are kind of contributing to how the classifier is making the decisions, right? So the thing that we're classifying is speeches that are either for or against the reproductive health bill. Yeah. And so, all right. So if you're taking a look at your version of the code, so it should be your copy of this WMSCI classification. If you open up this folder, this is what the data is able to see. This is what the code is able to see. So I think this Google thing is able to generate the sample data. I think it's just something that it gives you for free, but it doesn't have access yet to the data that we have over here. So I would like to request that you sort of download this somewhere and then put it up here. Does that make sense? So you can go here to the data set, right click and download it. Yeah, so let's say I'm downloading it here. Yeah, I don't know, like let's say here onto my desktop. And then you can upload it into this R code by uploading desktop. Where did it go? RB. Okay. So now my code is able to interact with that CSV file. How is it doing?
Sorry, that was a bit too quick for me. I've downloaded the file, but how did I
Okay.
the classification?
Okay. So over here on the left,
Yeah.
You will see this folder right icon. So click on that, and then click on this button here that says upload to session storage.
You can also drag and drop from your
Okay.
files.
Oh yes, yeah, that would probably be much easier. So if you have the folder with you, you can just drag and drop. Okay, you all good? All right. Oh my gosh, we're about to do this. Okay, for people online, anyone with any major questions at this stage?
I don't have the.
What do you need?
I tried to add the file, but I don't know what all of this is now.
Oh, I don't have that.
Can I just do the other?
No.
I legit just went and did this,
Okay, yeah.
and then chose this one,
All right.
and then open.
Okay, should be fine. We can just ignore the rest, I think.
Okay.
Oh, but yours is. I wonder what that is. Yours just looks like mine, right? Yeah. Okay. Sorry, Sandra. I can take a closer look.
It's fine, just random data files.
Okay. I wonder what that is. Yes. But okay. So if we manage to get over that hurdle of opening your copy of the code and uploading the data to where the code can see it, the rest is just running. So the first block might take a couple of seconds, so we'll just do that. We'll do it first. The button. I usually just okay. So you can just hit okay.
You can press the play button on the
You
left.
have to-
Yeah.
Usually. Have you been able to run it? Is it running? Okay. Yay. So this will take a while. I think when I tested it earlier, it was like 20 seconds. So
Oh wow.
hopefully that's fine. Just for the first one. How are you doing? It's running. Okay, that's nice. Yeah, usually I run these on my own interface using R programming. So I'm actually not as familiar with this browser. Since the last time that I used it, they also have like this icon here, which refers to like some generative AI assistant. So you can actually use that to help you, like if you get an error, this browser thing already tells you how to fix it, which is pretty cool. Very friendly again for like first-time coders. But for now, hopefully nothing will require that.
We have a question.
Yep, question. Nadia. This one, no. So everyone with a Google account should be able to run like this sort of stuff. So it's totally free. Yeah. If you are doing somewhat more computationally expensive procedures, then I think there's like a token system. But the stuff I'm going to show you now is very like low volume and will not ask you to pay. Okay, so mine's done. How are you guys? All right, nice. we're heading there. Okay. This next block is just going to read in the data, and it's also going to show us what the data looks like. This one should be pretty much instant.
Mine didn't work.
Oh no!
I can't find the file.
Oh, good. Okay. The okay. So it's all right.
Yeah, of course.
I think that if I'm not so it's not. Is yours okay? Okay.
Maybe I should just try to delete all the files and add it again. I don't want to.
No, that's okay. That's just really what the time is for. But yeah.
I have no idea what any of this is because this is a new laptop, so I don't even have our.
Yeah. Okay. For some reason, it might want us. Yeah, okay, now it's good.
Okay.
So what I did was I right click and then copied the path.
Copy path and you copy.
So I don't know what's going on here, but it has that specific quirk of wanting a slash. Okay. So good. Okay. So here you can actually read the text, right? So what I did was I didn't actually give you the speeches themselves, but I broke the speeches up into sentences. And then I told you whether the sentence came from a speech of someone who voted for or against the law. Yep.
So yeah, someone in the chat just said they need 20 seconds. So maybe my question can fill the space.
Okay,
so if I wanted to use this code with my own data,
yes,
I would need to kind of create this CSV file before, like obviously.
Yeah.
Is the idea then that this is the kind of manual input coding, whatever you do first? So like, I'll give you an example. I work on project on nostalgia, and I'm very interested in kind of how it's spoken about in public spaces and on social media. So applying this kind of sentiment analysis, it would be taking sentences from online spaces that mention explicitly the word nostalgia and having pre-coded them as either framing it as a negative thing or a positive thing.
Yeah, or any number of categories is fine.
Okay.
And then, so at least for this code that I've given you guys, it's not the most resilient, I think. But what I've done is that as long as you have data that is in 2 columns, with the first column referring to the thing you want to label and the second column having the text, it should work. So later on, I'm actually gonna change the data set, and I'll show you how to change the code in order to run the same thing. But yeah, as long as you have just 2 columns in your data, with the first column being the label, the second being the text, the rest of it should run. Chat. Okay, all right. Thank you so much, Raj. Okay. All right. So now we've opened the data, we've seen the labels, we've seen the text. Next, scroll down a little bit further. Yeah, so right now you can see that I vote no on the basis of morality. For the positive, I support informed choice, the need for every child to be a wanted child. So you can kind of get an idea of what's going on, but we're going to try to make this a little bit more systematic with this computational modeling stuff. So this next block is really just cleaning the data. I can just like enumerate the things that are going on here, right? Like it's removing punctuation marks, it's removing numbers, it's making everything lowercase. This one should be fairly quick. Yeah, there. So it's done pretty much instantly. And then you can kind of see what that clean text now looks like, right? So yeah, I find it inappropriate, Mr. Speaker, that this bill would wittingly or unwittingly open the floodgates of promiscuity. Yeah, that's how people are voting no. Okay, good. Did the cleaning work for everyone? Okay. Yay. All right. How about online? Right. Oh, perfect. Working. Very nice. Okay. It's a nervous one. Okay. So the next step is it may take a few more seconds, but it's essentially converting all this bunch of text into the, what I mentioned was the document term matrix. So there are 993 documents, and after running this code, it actually breaks down the speeches into 2,556 terms, right? So that the D is the documents, the T is the terms. And so from these 993 speeches, instead of one column that has all of the text, it's now broken up into 2,556 columns. And it's telling you that, for example, for document 139, it contains the word children. So that's why there's one here. It contains the word family, right? There's this one document 322 that actually mentions the word life 4 times. So this is what's going on here. It's now a version of the data that computers are able to interact with and perform statistical analysis on. Yes.
Just out of curiosity, what's the sparsity?
Yeah. So because most words are not, most documents are not going to contain most of the words. That's just basically estimating how many of the terms in this matrix are 0. So this is just rounded up. It obviously isn't 100% zeros. Yeah, but it's a very sparse matrix because most of the columns will be zeros. Yeah. Good. Yes.
Is this like otherwise like build children family? They pre-coded terms, or have they just come up with them?
Yeah, very good question. No, so these words are not pre-coded at all. But basically, the first this document 139 uses the word children, family. It's about those things. And so every single word that is used throughout the entire data set become the columns. Yeah, and then there's some filtering here. I made it so that the words would have to appear in at least 1% of the data. So that's why it's 0.99 here. Right? So that way I'm not making the matrix blow up in size. But yeah, so that's a very good question. We're not pre-identifying the words. In fact, we're making the selection of words be a data-driven process. Right, so that's what allows us to actually study what's being said. Great.
So if I wanted to have words that only appeared 10% of the text, I would change the sparse to 0.90.
0.90, yes. Very good. All right. So, question online. Perfect. Are the docs the same? Yes, the docs are the sentence numbers. Thank you. Very good. Yeah, so just to demonstrate what Sandra mentioned, this is a relatively small data set, so 0.90 will be kind of, yeah, I don't think it really moved anything. It didn't really change much. It's not really moving. But I think that's just because the data is fairly small. So these numbers are not super sensitive. When you're dealing with larger data sets, the document term matrix will be extremely sensitive to the number that you put in there. But anyway, so the next block, if you hit the play button, should be fairly quick also. And that just now looks at, okay, if this is your document term matrix, I'm now going to look at if you sum each column, it now actually tells you, okay, this is how much the word is used throughout the entire data set. And there was a time that this alone was enough to write a paper, right? Like just word frequencies, and people would convert this visually into like a word cloud, where like the words with the highest frequency are the ones, that are represented big, and then the smaller words are represented small. Right, so here you can now see that across all of these sentences, here are the words that are used the most. So it's about a bill. So the word bill is the most used word. People are addressing the Speaker of the House. So speaker is, the next word. And then you start to see some of the stuff that might underlie the conflict between the pro and the anti-bill people. Right, so you see the word health. Health is a very contested concept here. You're seeing words like family, children, and population, life. Women are interestingly like pretty down there in the list. Poverty, poor, human education, government services, right? So it's a very, I mean, even just from looking at the word frequencies, you're already starting to see, what are the things people are talking about when trying to debate over this bill. Any questions? But yeah, like even just this, there was a time that this could already be a result section. All right. Okay.
Can I check though? So far,
Yes.
it's only worked with the column of text data. It hasn't really, the stance stuff hasn't really mattered for anything that we've
No.
done. Okay.
Very good, very good. Yeah. So all of these computations have just been on the text. Stance is not featured into any of this yet.
There was also a question online I saw pop up.
Okay. Are there words that occur? Yes. So definitely. So right now we haven't started measuring these things across the two stances yet, but definitely, like for example, bill will probably be used on both sides. But we're going to start to see those sorts of computations in a bit. But yes, very good question. So the next block actually is the thing that does that actually makes the classifier. And all you really need to know is that to run it, there's this part of the code that says it's a random forest model. A random forest model, and it's trying to predict the label by using all of the words, right? And then we're going to evaluate how well that model does by looking at those standard performance measures for a classifier. So if you run it, I think this one, oh, this is pretty fast. How about you guys? Is it fast? Is it done? Yeah. And there you have it. If you haven't played with text waves yet, then you've just trained your first text classifier. Good job. So it can actually be very straightforward. As you can see, these are the performance measures.
This is a stupid question, but in terms of the negative, positive numbers, is that just a count of your labeling of the stances?
Oh yeah, perfect. Yeah. So here on the rows, these are the predictions of the model.
Okay.
And then here on the columns, these are the actual stances that the speeches are coming from. So this time, this data set was not labeled by me. Rather, I got the speeches of the Congress people that were debating, and then I identified whether the sentence came from a pro-bill person or an anti-bill person.
So how they voted rather than what they said.
Yeah, but here they're actually explaining their votes, so they should ideally be aligned. So the first thing that is coming out, this is what we call a confusion matrix, right? So we've trained the model to learn that mathematical relationship between the words and the stance towards the bill. And then, okay, once you train the model, you then ask it to generate those predictions, right? So you have the actual labels and you have what the model is predicting, and it's going to produce this confusion matrix. In general, you would hope that the bigger numbers are the ones with this middle diagonal, right? Top left and bottom right, because that means the true label is negative and the prediction was negative. The true label was positive and the prediction was positive. And then you're going to see on the off diagonal, those are what you would call the errors, right? So my model predicted it was negative, but in fact, the sentence came from somebody that was voting for the bill. And then this one, I thought it was positive, the model thought it was positive, but the sentence was actually from a negative speech. And then you see these performance measures over here. Accuracy is the overall, you can think of it as like the overall performance of the model, meaning the proportion of this matrix that is on the diagonal, so 542, 328, and then divided by the total number of data points. So that's the accuracy. So it's pretty good. It's able to capture with a 87% accuracy. That's not so bad. And this is with what we described as like the most basic form of representing the texts, right? So if we were to use a slightly more complicated version, then we would expect that the performance would improve. Precision means that of the ones I said were negative, how many were actually negative, right? So 95%, so that's very good. 77% for positive, so I'm less precise when finding support for the bill. Recall is kind of like the opposite of that. Like of the ones that are actually negative, how many did I correctly identify? So 85%, 92%. Then F1 is like this sort of harmonic average between the precision and the recall. So in general, the model is better able to identify negative speeches than positive speeches, but for both, it's doing pretty okay. Questions so far?
Yeah, I had heard before that it's a good idea to train your model on the data that you're not going to analyze. Is that something that for this kind of thing isn't necessary, or because you already know like the ground truth from the voting, not from the text, therefore you can use the whole data?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So for doing text classification, it depends on what you intend the classifier to be used for. So if my idea is I want this classifier to then predict future data points that I have no idea what the label is, then I would take the data that I do know the labels and then split them out. So I would learn the model using one part of it and then actually evaluate on the other part. In this case, we have all of the labels for everything. So the idea here is I just want to know how separable are the data points. So here I wouldn't need to do that segregation anymore. Yeah, but if I want to actually create a tool, then this would not be a fair evaluation, right? Because I know everything.
So if we were running this with our own data, you would recommend splitting it where half of it is used to train and half of it is used to evaluate?
So usually the usual splits are more like 70-30 or 20. So that way your model is able to learn from more examples.
Okay.
Yeah. So it might depend on like how much you're trying to predict in the future. Yeah. So I think we were shown by the previous speaker, sometimes you would also introduce like a time-based split in the data. Like for example, if you have data from January to December, but your goal is to make the classifier predict future examples, then to get a better handle on your accuracy, you might want to split for like January to September and then try to predict the labels on October to December. So there are certain decisions that you have to make that are more data specific. Yeah. Right, how are we doing? Yeah, oh my gosh. All right. So this next bit is where we try to interpret how the model is actually working. And I think this should also be fairly quick. Hit the play button. This is now where we take a look at what did the model use to make those decisions. And it's pretty funny. Are you all getting the same numbers as me?
No.
No, slightly different?
Okay. Oh yeah, no, I'm getting the same, sorry.
Same, okay. Yeah. Okay, yeah, no problem. So some of the estimation procedures are not necessarily deterministic. So we actually have to do some process to make sure that all of us are getting the same numbers. Like in general, the ranking should be fairly stable, but the numbers themselves might not be the same. But if you're seeing the same, that means it's working properly. All right, so now you can actually see that here are the words that the model is using to make the decision. And somewhat somewhat obviously, the word yes is very helpful for the model to classify between texts, because in certain sentences in the speech, they're actually saying, I vote yes. And so when the model sees that, it's like, okay, it's probably one saying more than the other. For some reason, no is not, I have one blank row. Well, we'll get to that in a bit. But if you have a blank row and it's like one of these, like this dot, 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 that just means it's skipping a bunch of the rows in the middle so that it can go down all the way. Yeah. So anyway, so the most important word is yes. Its importance score is 18. So that's like, yeah, this is like, if I see yes, I'll probably guess a certain way. Interestingly, bill was the most frequent term, right? But it's not actually one of it's not actually the most decisive term. And that really just tells you that bill is being used by, both of these different groups. So it's not as informative. It's really just yes. But rights and services and party are the next after yes. So this is telling me that in this speech about reproductive health, reproductive rights, there's maybe one group that is actually invoking those concepts more than the other. So services, rights, that's the perspective of one group, and the other group does not really talk about the debate in terms of services and rights. Right. And so I actually have this additional column here it's the same numbers, but with a sign, right? And the sign just is meant to indicate whether this term is used more by the pro people or the anti people. So most of the numbers that are in the top bunch of rows are actually positive. So they're telling you that these are the words that are used by the pro RH bill folks, right? So they say yes, they say services, rights, and party. They actually say school and choice. Gabriela is one of the sort of progressive political parties. Planning, long. So just based on that, what do you think the people that are pro this bill are talking about? Services, rights, school choice, both planning. What do you think? Is there argument for the bill? Any thoughts? Want to take a guess?
Sure.
Yeah, go ahead. It's okay. You're just
It's about
yeah. That's what the debate is. So if I'm pro that bill, I will use those words, right? Services, rent.
Asking if you can repeat the question.
Oh, okay, yeah, Rakshi. So my question was just looking at the words that the model thinks are important. Let's focus on the words which have positives first on the right column. So yes, services, rights, school, choice, planning, right? What do you think is the argument that they're making for why the bill should be passed?
people should have.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Good, good. Right. Yes, exactly. So that's one of the big reasons that they were saying that if we pass this bill, it's in honor of giving people the choice to make decisions about their own bodies, right? So that's like a big thing that distinguishes those that are for the bill and those that are against the bill. As long as I start using that language, that probably means I want the bill to be passed. Good.
Seems to be a human rights, women's rights sort of angle as well.
Yes, very good. Yeah, women's rights, human rights. What's the word rights in there? Yeah, rights, access. That would be in there as well. Yep, and Rakshi, that's exactly right. Choice and decisions over bodies. Very good. So right, access, education, information. So it's really like this sort of like thinking about people, women in particular, as active decision makers over their own bodies. And that stuff about services is also there for like the state providing the the resources needed to make those decisions.
But also the making informed decisions, I think school education,
Yes.
information. So it's this idea of people need to understand what this right is
Good.
to understand how to use it if they want to.
Very good. Yes. So there's these different all sort of like nodes to that argument, right? So yeah, so it's not just about your decision, but having the right information as well as the right resources to make those decisions. Rakshi makes a very good critical point here. I'm a bit apprehensive of taking that call because leaders equally use that language and words to argue the exact opposite thing. You're so right. So the reason why we're talking about these findings specifically in terms of this debate is because we're just talking about this debate. So we're not trying to extrapolate like, in terms of um, reproductive rights debates in general all around the world. We're just this is really just a descriptive exercise right now. But yeah, you're definitely right. At least in this case, it seems that these terms are making those distinctions meaningfully. But let's say if we had a bigger corpus of many more debates, we would then, if we ran this sort of the same code, and then we see that those terms are no longer actually distinguishing between pro and anti, then that would go straight to your point, right? That the leaders are also using that language to mean the opposite thing, and those words no longer distinguish between the political stances. Yeah. Okay, so now let's take a look at the negative terms. We actually have bill, will, population, life, answer. Okay, pills and condoms is interesting. Contraceptives, right? So let's just maybe focus on those first, right? So let's see again. Yeah, population, answer, pills and condoms, contraceptives. What's going on here? I wonder.
I mean, it's the argument that this shouldn't be seen as an alternative to, it shouldn't be seen as a contraceptive, right? So you should use condoms, you should use what's available. You shouldn't see it as we're talking about human life.
Yeah.
So
The population thing is possibly a pronatalist ideology.
or that it's a populist stance, right? Like we're speaking on behalf of the population. This is what the people want.
Yeah.
Could be both.
Yeah.
Good. Yes. So there's there's stuff that the word population could be connecting to one of those things, pronatalist stuff or populist stuff. There's this seeming
Personalization as well. I think there's just less about the humanity.
yeah.
Very abstract bill,
Speaker.
population.
Right.
Speaker.
And there seems to be this kind of unease with contraceptives, pills, and condoms. Like one would, at least before seeing these numbers, I would have thought that it's people that are for the bill that would be talking about these things, right? But it's when those things are mentioned that are associated with being against the bill. So there's something about these objects that is kind of being used to say, no, let's not pass this bill. So it might be that these objects are, I don't know, being painted with some kind of fear or, it's alien stuff. This next block of code might actually make things a little bit easier for us to take a look at things, right? So this is actually we open this in the tab. You can actually see, right, how the words are splitting up. At least for the top, I think I made it the top 50 or so. So rather than looking at just a bunch of numbers, you can actually see it visually. On the words that have bars on the right are the ones that are for the bill, and then on the left are those against the bill. So you're seeing the pills, the condoms, contraceptives, countries for some reason. Government is against. Like if you say government, it seems to be against the bill. So it might have something to do with if you're for the bill, you're saying people have more, are better able to decide over their bodies. But those against the bill might be saying the government is the one deciding for you. So that's pretty interesting area of disagreement. Poverty and billion also seems to have something to do with being against the bill. So that's pretty interesting. Woman is all the way down here. But that may be because both sides are talking about women, but with just a somewhat slight preference for those on the pro side, right? So the lower down we go, this sort of list of words, it actually does become less and less discriminative. So we're able to draw less strong conclusions about those words at the bottom.
So how do you decide where the cutoff is, what's diagnostic and not, or descriptive or not?
Yeah, so there isn't these numbers are not actually they don't have a statistical property that allows us to say be less than 0.05. Typically we do something where we which is actually on the next couple of code blocks where we actually look at how those words are used in context now, right? So once we start to see, okay, yeah, this is not, this seems like it's really a word that people are starting to use on both sides, then that's where we would qualitatively make that decision. From a more quantitative standpoint, we typically look for what's called the elbow. If you've done any kind of factor analysis, you would be familiar that some of these measures display sort of elbow, right? So if you're looking at it like this, right, there's this curve over here. The elbow would refer to where you start to see diminishing returns or diminishing rates of change. So over here, actually, the elbow might be somewhere here already, right? So after life, everything else kind of like flattens out. And so maybe after that, you wouldn't really be taking a look at the rest of the words anymore. But they're still quite informative, right, for those who are curious. Okay. And I also want to maybe bring in that point again that this isn't entire speeches, but just individual sentences from those speeches. So it's quite interesting that, you know, even individual sentences, you can already kind of sort them out. I mean, some sentences are definitely going to be very informative, like if I say I vote yes, right? But even throughout the entire speech, it's very clear which position person is coming from. Okay, and then because we're interested in, you know, like questions of social construction and meaning, I put in this block that actually helps us take a look at those sentences which contain the specific words. So here, for some reason, I stopped on late, but maybe let's look at life. Right? If I run that code, it's going to bring out the sentences that actually use that word life. And you can start to see how those words are actually being used in context of those speeches. So, Mr. Speaker, this bill violates our Declaration of Principles that the state shall always protect the life of the unborn from conception. Why? Third, this is against life. End of the day, I ask is whether the state, in its effort to attain its gross targets, have overstepped its bounds in choosing to interfere in its citizens' family life. Right. So there's some meanings of life here that are about, you know, the right to life and whatnot. But there's also that stuff that we kind of mentioned earlier about impinging on people's ability to decide about their own lives. So it's interesting that, you know, actually both sides are referring to some sense of agency, but it's different. It's just framed in a different way. The more like explicitly religious stuff. I am the way, the truth, and the life, saith the Lord our God. Yeah, but let's take a look at the words that we identified quantitatively, just to see, like let's say if we were to look at condom. Yeah, so this is pretty interesting. Yeah. So when they refer to the specific, like, you know, objects like condoms and pills, one of the numerical things we were seeing earlier is it's actually those that are against the bill that mention it. And here we're starting to see how it is actually being used in context, right? So one is there's an economic argument, right? Oh, because of this bill, it's going to require the local government to use their limited funds to buy all of them, and it's actually not going to improve people's lives, right? So this isn't like the typical, or it's not like the religious argument, right? That you might expect, but here it's actually making an economic argument. So even the pro-lifers are like, you know, are invoking economic discourses in order to go against the law. Yeah. So on the one hand, it's about limited resources, but they're also questioning whether it would actually make any impact. So the solution is not killer condoms. That's not going to help. They also bring in the fact that, you know, Filipinos already live in a time of economic hardship, and so if you're using those funds to buy condoms, they're not really an answer to people who have nothing to eat, right? So it's a kind of whataboutism. Yeah. There is actually this one that maybe you would have expected. I do want to see progress, but not at the cost of our youth's moral values that will be corrupted by the proliferation of these objects. Yeah. Okay. Any word that you guys are interested in?
Anything else? This is excellent sort of way to probe text, large amounts of text for things that you want to find.
Very good. Yes. So yeah, that's an excellent point. So the stuff I was discussing earlier, right, about what is the place of quantitative methods and qualitative methods when we're engaging with these questions of collective social construction. Without the quantitative methods, you could maybe decide on your list of probing words from a theoretical standpoint. Like that would make a lot of sense. But especially with like larger and larger data sets, it might be very difficult to figure out an appropriate starting point. Like sometimes conceptually, like let's say I was interested in social identity, but I don't necessarily know the words related to social identity that feature within a particular cultural context, within a particular political debate, right? And so the numbers actually help you figure out, okay, what are at least statistically, what are the words that are showing the differences between the political stances? And then using those numerically derived words as a starting point to then do this like more qualitative analysis. Oh, oh. Oh yeah. Hi Tina. So this is from Tina's paper back in 2016, I think. Is that right? Or, yeah, 2017. So I also am not sure. I think Tina back then, so I wasn't part of this paper, no, but I think back then the analysis was just using the word frequencies. So they didn't take a look explicitly at the it was using this earlier numbers, right? Just the word frequencies for the two data sets, and then interpreting like how they're being used. So back then, I don't think you used the classification model. So it's the classification model that is doing the decision in this version of the analysis. Yeah. So God, let me see how God is used. But yeah, God and health were not actually the statistically most discriminative words. Yeah, I think so, Tina. I think one of the reasons when you actually start to look at the uses of God, of course, there are the somewhat more obvious ones, right? Like, this is the RH bill seeks to prevent and frustrate the Lord our God from giving life. So that is, I think, what was the greater like emphasis in the previous paper. But here you're actually seeing that some of the yes votes are also invoking God, which is why the model doesn't think it's the most discriminative term. So like, for example, here, if a mere RH bill can lower our faith in God, then that insinuation is an insult to the Catholic Church, right? This one, as I contemplated and prayed, I came across one passage in the Bible that states that God has given us free will to choose and is never judgmental. Yeah. So I think I think this speaks to that sort of maybe deeper point of how the methods have really been changing. So back then, I think the paper really just looked at the frequency counts. But if you measure not frequency but discriminative ability, then it looks like God is not all powerful in between the categories. Yeah.
So if I had a data set, sorry, I'm trying to think this through.
Oh, good.
Data. So we have a lot of open responses from multiple countries asking people what's the greatest era in history and why is it the greatest era? And so we have these open-ended responses where people talk a lot about wars. And what we found in our coding of it is that wars are referred to in the thematic frame of people talking about moral heroism. Like, we defeated evil, we beat the Nazis in the UK, we overcame whatever the colonizers. So could we use this to then look at the distribution of words, I guess, and then zoom in to look at, okay, every time the word war is used, does it actually fit this framework of being about moral heroism? Yeah, we could do. Okay.
Absolutely, yes.
Cool. And I could just copy your code.
Yeah, and then you could use this exact file,
just with my own.
just change the thing that's in here. Yeah. The idea is that your effort should be minimal. You put it in and then bam.
Opposite of qualitative research.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's the quantitative part. Once you get here, the qual will get.
No, exactly. But
crazy.
I think it's a nice way when, at least when I've been working with open-ended responses, because it's more on a content analysis level rather than a deep kind of thematic level. So having this as a kind of entry point into exploring the data rather than doing the heavy reading of everything.
Yeah, I think that was one of the points that we made yesterday is that this is where a certain kind of research would stop, but here is where the interpretative stuff would begin. Yeah.
There's so many creative ways of using content analysis and all these classification clustering techniques. I mean, it's really limitless. I did a classification thing with the historical memory, comparing to countries.
Yeah.
And most of the theoretical heavy lifting was really a structural analysis, like interpreting why certain things clustered differently in different countries.
Yeah.
The statistics didn't really tell all that much. All they did was describe the data.
Yeah.
So that I wouldn't have to do it by hand for, I don't know, 600 people in each context.
Yeah, and that's what we found. I mean, in our when we published the first paper with this, which was only 3 countries, now we have I think 8. It was more like the manual labor of how many people referred to British Empire, how many people refer, so it is that kind of the descriptive stuff of the content analysis. This can do really well, but I agree, it's there's a limit. It's not interpretive.
Oh, there it is. This is for do it by hand, whatever. Yeah. For this one question, would this be complementing the original argument or kind of contradicting it? That's a very good point. I think if you wanted to write a sequel paper, I think that would be an interesting thing to try. In fact, the methods that I'm showing here are maybe a 2019, 2018 version of what we did in 2015. Now we could probably also consider the 2025 methods, like large language models, and seeing how they would also interface with this sort of data. My sort of tentative assessment is that it would definitely complement, not really contradict. In that we could show that still it's really that full difference between God and rights, and you can also start to see what the exceptions look like. And I think within the political space, especially in a sort of polarized setting, something that some political actors want to do is be able to access the opposing camps followers, right? If I say that thing God here, if a mere RH bill can lower our faith in God, then that insinuation is an insult to the Catholic Church. This is the way for one of these more progressive politicians to then invoke actually you don't have a monopoly on God, right? And so it would be interesting to see this is the general pattern, right? That maybe invocation of God is still more in line with being against the bill. But here are the sort of more agentic ways that people are trying to negotiate that overall.
That fluidity
within the structure, exactly, yes. So, this sort of methodological, approach is really just always reflecting that theoretical commitment to fluidity within structure. Just typing. I'm so glad this is It's getting quite interactive. Before I, yeah, let's just, so there are just two more blocks here. You can just run them. But if you didn't want to choose, like specific terms to probe, you could actually run these blocks. And what they're doing is they're asking the model to kind of look at the speeches again and try to predict, right? So we know what their actual labels are, like if they're positive or negative. But if you ask the model to predict, it gives you a probability, right? So then I'm ordering the sentences in terms of the probability that the model is thinking that this is positive or negative. So in a way, that is a way for the model to kind of quantitatively indicate which ones are the ones it is most sure about and which ones it is less sure about. Right. So close the chat.
The last one is the right thing is to support the bill, which is sort of the opposite of what you were wanting to predict, right?
Yes, I think so. Yeah, is that right? Sorry, there's so much scroll. Yeah, I vote no, not on the basis of that. So this one is the most no all the way down.
That makes sense then.
Yeah. So these are the ones that the model thinks are the easiest to classify. And so, I vote no is like the most obvious one, I think. I based my vote upon my own personal knowledge and concept of what ought to be, and I have anchored my vote upon the defects and inherent flaws of the bill itself. So these are the ones that the model sees are the most obvious. There's a no.
Some of these make me want to, like, for example, however, because of the ayes and nays, I changed my mind.
Mm-hmm.
That kind of speech is extremely, like I was thinking before, like depersonalized. Like it's not about the people, it's not about the issue.
Yeah.
It's very much the political level.
Mm-hmm.
Like I'm thinking about it in terms of party, in terms of the political machinations, etc.
Mm-hmm.
That's something maybe I could follow up with, like qualitatively, see if it's like available as a discourse in several others or something.
Yeah, for sure. I think in terms of follow-ups, I think that's a very interesting it's a very interesting lens, because like what we're looking at is the public speeches. If you're starting to see patterns that you then want to maybe study in a more focused way, that would show that these methods can help you on like an exploratory level, and then you may want to like then look at stuff in a more confirmatory way. That's definitely a dynamic that this sort of methodology is open to. So this block is for probing the sentences by word, and then these other blocks are just like I'm not really sure what words I want to probe. I just want to see the ones that the model is most sure about, right? Yeah.
It's a really interesting discussion point in the chat as well.
Oh, let me see. It would look like earlier papers, especially by hand, pulled out paragraphs as exemplars of a category, while the current fascinating model is working with how frequently a word occurs. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yes. Well, so the idea hopefully is that these are not, replacing the previous methods in the sense of like they're no longer valid, but like I think as we were trying to discuss, like this isn't intended to supersede qualitative analysis, but to hopefully guide like a sort of structured way of a certain kind of entry points into these big qualitative data sets. Yes, I think I would like to think it is deepening the process as well. Yes, that's a great way to put it. Yeah.
I mean, in some ways, I don't know, like if these kinds of methods really deepen as much as just gives you a different angle of or a different perspective
Yeah.
on things.
Right.
Yeah, if anything, it makes me more critical of this because I think
Good.
when you look at it on the basis of the words and their sentiments, when you probe like this, like some of them, you see double negatives or false positives or
Yeah.
sarcasm or whatever, which makes you, again, the context is brought back into understanding word use, which I think gives so much more richness and actually makes me aware that, like, it restores my faith in the importance of qual.
Yeah. Yes.
Because it's one thing to count words, it's another thing to contextualize words.
Yeah, I think Tina is saying the label emerges from the computations plus local contextualized knowledge rather than having the coding dependent on the predetermined. Absolutely, yeah. And I think I really like the way that you put that because I think that was also my sort of journey with these methods. Like I was really thinking that it's not about replacing them, but it actually highlights how much more we really need to be critical.
And I guess the good thing about like the comment Tina is making about the labels coming from the computation is that it might actually make you aware of something that you weren't looking for. Like why would a certain word be coming up so much in a context of a discussion where I wouldn't anticipate to see it? And that I think can open up also new avenues of qualitatively investigating it. But that would only happen by seeing the frequency of it rather than by seeing it in general.
Great. Yeah. So our relationship to the methods is not something that we frame as a one-way thing, right? It's not that the algorithm dictates to us what the result is. But in the same way, like we're not also predetermining everything that the model can do. So it allows us to be open to surprising things that the measurements can show us. And so, yeah, and I think that's really how we mean non-assimilative way of applying these methods for like critical research, that you're not being dictated by the model, but you have this sort of agentic relationship with it as well as a person that's interpreting the data and what the model is doing. Yeah, so that's actually what I wanted to show for this morning. So we did use up the entire 3 hours. Is that okay for
Yes, of course.
Yeah.
I mean, we have half an hour.
Yes.
Yes, I was gonna say obviously as a non-coder, this is also a really, really good template. If you aren't great at coding, like the actual code itself, like how could you recommend learning it, or are there other like AI devices I can use? So like, could I use and say I want to do these steps? Can you write me a code?
Yeah.
What would you recommend actually learning code generally?
So just like Simon, I would say that large language models are very helpful for learning to code. Like my personal thing, this is not meant to be prescriptive. My personal thing is I'm not gonna ask an LLM about life, so I don't think it knows the meaning of life. But I think a computer program is very good at computer programming. So I would be willing to ask it like, hey, this is the form of my data, and I want to extract these certain things from it. What is a good way to? Yeah. And I think he did show us examples, right? Like if I want to modify this code a certain way, how would I do it? So I'm not as familiar with this particular interface, but I do know that it says this generate with AI. I think there's a way to use this interface itself to like ask it, like I want to do this. How should I do it? I am very like hesitant to try it out like right now. but I think increasingly these coding platforms want to be more friendly to like people who are not like veterans at it. But yeah, I think Tina's also making a very important point. We're cautious about depending on predetermined labels because they are often latched onto weird knowledge. Yeah. So that's one of the big things that also draws us to these methods, that they're able to use the words themselves. So as you pointed out, Nadia, they're not words that we predict, but we're actually looking at the words that are used in the speech.
Okay. So yeah, we have half an hour for discussion, questions.
Yeah. Clearly there's a discussion
And then we can take a break.
Okay, yeah, that's great. Tina, have you eaten dinner already? I think it's 7 p.m. at home.
So does this interface, can it support things like TF-IDF or
Yeah, absolutely.
word embeddings?
I think word embeddings just require a few extra steps, but it's just one of those like little options. Like over here, it says the weighting is term frequency, so it's TF. There's just like a small thing here you would need to edit if you can't get it.
Yes.
So okay, yeah, Fouad asks an interesting question because the previous speaker told us about all these different ways of representing text. So term frequency, which is just the number of times a word is used in a given, data point, is like the most basic, right? And you can have additional weighting schemes. So the TF-IDF model is a way to down weight certain terms that just appear everywhere, right? Because maybe they're not very informative. And then there are these more advanced models that use like high dimensional vectors and whatnot. Typically, if your interest is making a more accurate model or like a model that's good at really distinguishing between the codes, you may want to use those more complicated representations just because they're just shown to be much better at performing that task. I personally think that term frequency still has a place if your goal is to interpret what's going on. Because it's one thing to say that, oh, if a term is used 4 times, then it's making this decision. You just know what that means, right? But if a word has a TF-IDF of 0.68, it doesn't have an intuitive meaning. I would say it's kind of analogous to when you're doing regression and you're trying to decide between unstandardized and standardized coefficients, right? Unstandardized is in the scale of the original measurement. Standardized is like, like standard deviations from the mean. That's like, it's a little bit harder to interpret, but it does have its own.
I mean, considering how easy it is to do this in this code,
Yeah.
you could do both.
You could do both, just compare. Yeah.
And see if it works differently. But also, one of the reasons I was asking is one of the things that Simon was telling us was about like the LLMs is that they're so inaccessible to a lot of people who are resource poor. Whereas this apparently is free.
Yeah.
And you could do something like TF-IDF or word embedding.
Yes.
Is already plenty, like Simon was saying. To get a lot of. I mean, he showed a couple of papers that were published just last year or something with TF-IDF and word embedding. So it's still like.
It's still very
performant. Yeah.
And well accepted. Yeah. Yeah.
So it's a tool that is accessible to everybody everywhere without having an AI key or having to buy anything. So that
just copy paste and you're done.
I think is really exciting.
And absolutely.
For people to know.
Mm-hmm. And of course, like these methods we developed from our resource strapped context. So this really is meant to align with those contexts as well. I think besides the computing resources, there's also the issue of data. Like sometimes if you're studying collective social constructions within like the Philippine context, you're not gonna have like 100 million texts to work with, right? And so like if you're trying to, for example, what is it called? Transfer learn or fine tune like a word embedding model, you're just not going to have enough data to do that with either. So it ends up being that TF-IDF would also just be the more practical thing to do. Yeah.
And it's not these huge, I mean, if it's working this well on a corpus of, how many was it, 2,500 or something?
Yeah.
Sentences, wasn't that? That's not too much.
Yeah.
Data. You could get that data, that amount of data in a study context.
Yep, absolutely.
I think a lot of people, when they're thinking about computational or big data,
millions.
It's like, I remember I asked one colleague once, like, can I use like computational techniques for this? And I had like, I don't know, a few thousand sort of blog posts and things like this. And he's like, no way, you need at least 100,000.
No, definitely not. And again, I think it also just really depends on what you see to be the purpose of these computational methods. Like if your goal is, to create the perfect universal context-free model that classifies texts as like positive or negative, you would need a huge amount of data, right? If you want a universal general purpose tool. But in this case, we don't have those kinds of goals, right? We want to understand something that is contextually embedded, it's contextually rich. And in a way, having a universal tool would make it worse, right? Because you're now bringing in this information from like other contexts that have nothing to do. Yeah, exactly. So, and I love Tina's point here. This tool is accessible and permits listening to and making sense of local talk in a way it democratizes the agentic power of knowledge production. Yeah. So, we don't need, $1,000 computing resources to do any of this. Thank you so much to Rakshi for your participation. We still have like a second half after we take a break for lunch. Tina, you may want to go to sleep. But thank you so much also for coming and talking with us. This is very lively. I love it.
Yeah, so we definitely will be back for an afternoon session. We'll be looking at the clustering
Yes.
models instead of the classification ones, but it should be fairly parallel to what we did.
Yep, absolutely, yeah. Yeah. Thank you so much. Yeah.
I have a question. So the one that we ran through now had stances and text, but can you give some other examples of what we could use instead of stances? So off the top of your head, just to think a bit more creatively about it.
Sure. So like the examples that I showed earlier during the presentation, like if I had a bunch of COVID speeches and I'm gonna ask it to classify if this came from a rich country or a poor country. Or if you have enough data, you can have finer grained labels like which country, not just the economic class of the country, but which country.
Okay.
What are other things we've used?
Because one thing that we're trying to do now with our data is to categorize our countries according to post-colonial, post-imperial, to see whether the ways in which they engage with history differs.
Perfect. That would be perfect.
Use that as a classifier.
Yeah. So if that column would be whether that those words came from post-colonial, whatever.
Yeah.
This would just run.
Okay.
Same way. Yeah.
Amazing.
So what are the words that distinguish the meanings of a post-colonial person? Yeah, absolutely. We tried it also.
Tina loves it.
Yeah, great classifier. Exactly. Yes. Have you met Tina, or has Tina met?
I think Tina and I have met online and maybe at ISPP. I can't remember.
Okay. Yeah.
But I know Tina.
Yeah.
I know you and Tina as a pair.
As a cluster. Yeah.
Great. Thank you. That's really cool. That's really
Thank you. Good luck with that. That sounds super interesting. I'll be looking out for it. Mic, camera. That's all.
Yeah. Hello, everybody. We're starting back up again. As we said earlier, we're going to work through some examples now of clustering models. And thanks to Josh again for doing all of this. And sorry for the long break between. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, thank you for it. And I think this is our friend who's typing. Hello. Let's close this chat for now. But okay, thank you so much. So just to follow up on this morning's session, we will now shift from classification to clustering. And as a reminder, here the idea is we're still trying to connect our data with some kind of label that is derived with this sort of mathematical pattern that groups the data together, but the label is not previously determined here. So we're actually just starting with just the data, and what we do is we look for existing patterns or tendencies in the data to mathematically identify those latent groups or clusters. The important thing here is that whereas a classification model generally in certain use cases, you would train on some data and then try to classify other data. Here, when you do a clustering, there's no stage where you would then try to use those clusters for some other data, right? So the data that you analyze is also the data for the model. So as we try to talk about, can they be used to help us understand collective social construction? There are certain ways that you can say yes, certain ways you can also say no. But our hope is that through what we're about to do today, there are specific ways that you can make that yes more justifiable and make sense. So for text data, which is what we're primarily focusing on today, the typical starting point is really this data representation where you focus not just on individual words, which we were doing with the classification step, but with word co-occurrence. So the idea here is that when you have a clustering model or a clustering method, you're going to use these groups of words to find these sorts of patterns that you're interested in. So it's not going to be individual words, but the relationships between those words. From there, it's the quantitative stuff that helps you identify those groups of words in this context. And then the idea would be, once you have those groups of words, it's more the qualitative reading process that allows you to identify what those clusters are indicating, right? So it's essentially this process of connecting the dots. That can, for some, that can be a little bit of an uncomfortable process because previously we had a set of predetermined labels and you're just really trying to optimize this mathematical model to be accurate, right? But in this case, it's much more open-ended. So, that subjects you to a little bit of uncertainty. But for those of us who are into interpretative analysis, that can also be a nice window, right, for us to do something we might end up being more comfortable with instead. So I'm gonna, just like this morning, I want to talk through a couple of studies where we have used certain clustering methods just to give an idea of how they have been used in a research setting and the way that we have thought about how these methods connect with the kinds of questions we're interested in. So here we were actually, this is a project that we were working on with a graduate student who was interested in how our president was so into cursing. So pretty much he would curse, like at the time he was cursing out Obama, he was cursing out the Pope. And it was something that we were so, because even in other populist, settings, it's not like cursing was as salient as it was for Duterte. So in every single speech, there was some kind of, cursy utterance. And what we wanted to see was if we tried to systematically analyze how the cursing was functioning in his political language, what would we find, right? And so the method that we used at the time was a sort of network analysis. And so the idea here was that every word in our president's speeches was represented by one of these nodes or these oval type objects in this figure. And the words would be connected in this network if those words were used together within a speech, right? And so once we represented the data that way, so instead of speeches, it was now networks, we could then see which words were connected to each other. And using the mathematical properties of networks, there are ways to identify that some of these nodes are more densely connected than stuff that's outside those regions of the network. And so that's how we were able to identify quantitatively the clusters. And what we ended up doing was, okay, so in this representation, we actually have 3 clusters. We then ended up looking at how those clusters corresponded to different ways that swearing was used in the speeches, right? So, yeah. So the method when we used this method to analyze swearing, what we were interested in was swearing as a sort of rhetorical act on its own. And so we actually did this thing that we don't usually do, but we collapsed all of the swearing words into a single node so that all the swearing ends up being treated exactly the same way in the data representation. And so when we looked at the clusters, they would all just kind of revolve around that unified swearing word. But anyway, so here were the results which we identified. The first cluster of words that were used around swearing, or over here, there's like, where's cluster one? Here you go. So we were talking about, it's when the president would talk about his wife and women and all of that. And the way that we tried to interpret that was in terms of affirming vernacular identity. So whenever the president would swear, it was some kind of way of affirming these sorts of identities that don't necessarily exist in the like proper dignified sense of society. So for example, the sort of nationalistic masculinity, my wife and I are separated too. No, it's the truth. She's German. I really surrendered because of her crazy tantrums. I searched for another girl. Maybe because I wouldn't really show up when there's Tagalog. Then I even asked my teacher why we had to be forced speaking in Tagalog, but I'm definitely Bisaya. When there's an election, look for an effective president. If he doesn't deliver, expletive, go ahead and kill him. Anyway, it's easy to kill a person. So the common thing that we were sort of detecting across this sort of cluster was essentially it was a way for the president to kind of express his resistance to these sorts of more quote unquote polite ways of talking about things, right? So in terms of his sort of navigation of relationships with women, that the swearing would precede his utterances that would, like put himself as a man above her, or in this second instance, it's this sort of within the Philippines, there's a sort of linguistic hierarchy between those in the political center who speak Tagalog and those in the regions who speak Bisaya, and all of that. So that's the first one. The second one the second cluster that we were really interested in was when Duterte would claim outsider virtues. So for example, you expletive human rights people, I don't care about you, I hate drugs because I've seen how they destroy a Filipino child's life. From the beginning, I promised that many will die. I did it when I was mayor, and given the rising number of deaths, why do you suddenly dislike me now? And why do I have to pay you? And I'll tell the corrupt official, Duterte told me to slap you. So this was when Duterte was basically expressing his feelings against people who were criticizing his populist regime. People were criticizing the fact that he was doing these extrajudicial killings. He had a platform of a war on drugs where he promised that anyone that is even vaguely associated with drugs will just be shot. And his use of swearing here was specifically to position himself as an outsider, so somebody that isn't bound by these sorts of values that he's kind of claiming are only for insiders. So you human rights people, you're telling me that what I'm doing is wrong, but I've personally seen in my own being with the poor how drugs can destroy a Filipino child's life. Or I was the mayor in this province before, and so when he performs with this language and uses expletives, he's showing that I'm not part of this sort of system, this sort of moral system where you're condemning this stuff that I'm doing. Because I'm an outsider, but it's me. I'm the one who has the virtues. Because you, all that are on the inside, you're the ones who are corrupt, right? On this third cluster, on the other hand, we actually found the sort of reverse dynamic where instead of claiming the virtues of an outsider, now that he was president, he was actually using the cursing to kind of express now his ability to marshal the force of an insider. So if you destroy my country, expletive, I will kill you. These expletive want to imprison me, expletive, don't fool me. I tell the police and the military, if you just do your duty in accordance with the law, I will protect you. So for us, at least at the time when we were studying swearing in relation to swearing, our argument here was that swearing was not just about flouting norms of respectable speech, but it also performs these sorts of dual positioning dynamics. So when I'm talking about criticism against my regime, so where I'm Duterte, and I use swearing in my political speeches, I'm saying I am of this world and I will be the one to fix this broken system. If you're trying to use the language of human rights and democracy, that means you're an insider to the system and you don't really know what the world is like, right? And so I can justify my ability to be an outsider intervening on this political inside. But now that he's also the president, when he swears and is invoking the words that are on the third cluster, we were seeing that the swearing was now to put rhetorical force behind saying, I will use the system now to fix the world. So I'm swearing and I will use the police and the military to fight against your attempts to regulate the sort of change that I'm trying to undertake. Right. So that was one study that we did. So it was really just clustering the words around the swearing and finding out what were the sort of social construction processes surrounding the swearing. In the second study, we were again studying polarization, but one of the major things that we were interested in was within this sort of multilingual data set, what are the differences in the ways that people are talking in a polarized manner that is also different across the two languages. So in the Philippines, generally we do speak a lot of English, but we also speak a lot of the local language of Filipino, right? So when we're looking at a social media data set, you are going to find a whole mix of them. When we ran the clustering model, we were seeing that not only were the words themselves sort of splitting up based on like their meaning, but also in terms of the language used, there seemed to be like this sort of split, right? So it wasn't just that people were talking about different things, but within the different languages, they were also talking about different. So what we showed here was that if you were speaking in Filipino, these tended to be the words that were central within the cluster. So here we were looking at social media talk about the drug war, the parents' drug war. So people were using these Filipino words generally to talk about addicts and people and children's lives. And then the unique words in particular were like animal, to hang, thief, demon, and monster. So these were the words that were showing up within the Filipino cluster. Meanwhile, for the English cluster, it was more like human rights, extrajudicial killings, abuse, humanity, protection, incompetence, narco politics, democracy, right? So the way that we were thinking about it, not just that there's a difference in whether you're supporting or opposing Duterte's regime, but when you look at the language, both like the English-Filipino divide and the words themselves, you're seeing like these sorts of two splits in the meaning making. So what I mean by that is on the rows, we're seeing the discourses associated with the language. So here is in Filipino, people are talking about the drug war in terms of community security. And on the second row, they're talking about the drug war in terms of democratic integrity. And on the columns, we see whether they're for or against the president. And you're seeing that although there tends to be a sort of like correlation between the rows and columns, you're actually seeing two separate political positions emerge within the separate sort of linguistic layers. So for example, if you're talking in Filipino and you're talking about the drug war, whether you're supportive or against it, you tend to be talking about it in terms of security. But those concepts of security kind of are deployed in different ways. So for example, in the top left, we're seeing Father Duterte finally make communities safer from the monstrous and demonic addicts, pushers, and drug lords. Only the yellows, like the Lima, who was an opposition politician, want to protect them because they are also involved with drugs. Meanwhile, those that criticize Duterte, but using that same discourse, I'm less scared of addicts, pushers, and drug lords, and more frightened of the police. So children are being killed, and I fear for my life if the drug war doesn't stop. So it's still about security in the community, but that same discourse can be used for and against Duterte. On the second row, it's more about democratic integrity, and here's probably the more prototypical one. The drug war has resulted in countless extrajudicial killings and human rights abuses. The news media should report these facts, and other nations should witness what is happening in our country. Otherwise, we will continue to see the death of the rule of law and our democracy. And on the bottom left, because of the drug war, President Duterte can finally root out narco politics and incompetence from the government that is supporting the syndicates. The world should understand this is what the people elected as a democracy. So even if So generally, if they're criticizing Duterte and the drug war, they're invoking democracy and human rights, which kind of makes sense intuitively. But here on the left, you're also seeing how the same concepts can be used to defend, apparently, a drug war. That it is the will of the people, and it's actually like an expression of our democracy. So when you look at the actual posts here, you're seeing when those monstrous addicts get high, do you think they'll still see you as a person or a friend? No, he becomes an animal and he'll kill you. You'd also rather fight than die. I think they grew up in a subdivision, not in the streets. That's why they don't feel criminals and addicts. They live in a world that's far from the realities of life. So here on the left, you're seeing the voices of the people who are pro the drug war, and they're invoking these concepts of community security. Like, we are supporting the drug war because obviously drug addicts are monsters and they're animals, right? And if you're against the drug war, that means you just live in a world that's far from those realities of life. But what's really interesting is that same discourse can also be used to criticize the drug war. So here, before, I used to feel safe when I was with my children, but now I feel like there's no safe place in the Philippines. I'm more scared of the police than the addicts, snatchers, and hold uppers. At least if you encounter one of them, you still have hopes of living. But if you encounter the police, it's like you shouldn't hope anymore. Yes, before Duterte was my idol, we were all solid Duterte, but then so many minors have died, even pregnant women. If only they were really killing the rapists instead of just the fool, right? So what's really interesting is that generally, at least in the public sphere, critics of the drug war tend more to sound like this, right? You see them saying we're only killing criminals, but they just cannot understand you are not a criminal until proven for a court of law. So every one of them are innocent and must be presumed innocent according to the Constitution. When foreign media chooses to bring attention to extrajudicial killings, which by the way exist, you call it destabilizing the Philippines. Whether you're pro-Duterte or not, these should be wrong. So it's usually the criticism of Duterte invokes these sorts of discourses of democratic integrity. But in Filipino, it's about this. It's still about safety. They're not actually saying stop the drug war because of democracy and human rights, but because I also don't feel safe anymore. Like my children don't feel safe. So that was like one of the interesting things that we found. And then here, yes. Okay. And then here, I know in the heat of things, the president has made some rather blunt statements like kill them all and such. But what has he really said? What are his policies? He told officers, if those being arrested fight back and you feel your life is threatened, shoot them and I'll protect you. There's no difference in the president's policy in the US in this regard. At the time, I think there was there was an attempt to use the US as a sort of gold standard, right? President Duterte said that if in your accusations of human rights violations, you take away your aid, by all means, you do so. We will not beg. Dignity and integrity of the Filipino are more important. So in English, there are also ways to support Duterte's drug war, and it's in terms of invoking these also sorts of more democratic sounding principles and like national sovereignty and all of that. So what we were seeing was that really that there were divisions within the divisions, that when we were thinking about polarization, it wasn't just about those on the main diagonal here, right? These over here, the English-speaking democracy and human rights supporters, and the Filipino-speaking people who were like, no, the drug war is okay because it's gonna kill the drug addicts. But here on the off diagonal, we were also seeing these sorts of important spaces of somewhat like something like innovation in the social constructions, and maybe there was something in these off diagonals for hopefully addressing that state of polarized discourse. That if you're going to get through to the people here, they're probably not going to listen if you're going to talk about democracy and human rights. But maybe if you're also talking about how those safety and like the killings are not actually achieving the safety of the communities, then maybe this should be more emphasized.
Yes. Yeah. So my question is, do you think that there's like some kind of at least implicit intention to address these different rhetorical strategies towards different intended audiences? So like I know a lot of politicians in the global south, when they want to speak to the West, they put out their statements in English.
Yeah.
When they want to speak in domestically, they only speak in the native language.
Yes, yes.
Do you think something like that is happening here? Just regular people in the online discourse. Are they trying to reach each other's camps, or are they just simply embedded in those camps but have an opposing?
Right. That's a really good question. And that's what I think this is one of the things that we have been trying to explore now. It's not in published studies yet, but we've now been shifting from the online space to actually talk more to people within the communities. And what we're finding is that on some level, yes, there's that sort of more strategic, what do you call code switching that's happening, but also very much that they're embedded within the communities. So when we spoke with people, so right now the story actually is that Duterte is in the Hague, like he's been arrested and is gonna face trial at the International Criminal Court, and so he's back in public discourse despite not being the president anymore. So we've been trying to study that. And what we're finding actually is that those same findings, which we identified in the paper, is actually really coming out in people's talk. We're recruiting the people in these like focus groups from within the same communities, and so we're finding that no, actually, it's really that's really the way that they're thinking through these issues. Yeah, but that's an important like sort of like distinction, I think, and at least with online data, online data alone, you can't really assume one or the other, right? So what we're finding is that because it's matching how the actual communities are talking about it, it may not exclusively be an issue of just strategic communications.
Interesting. Thank you.
Thank you. And then finally, that was like one of the more recent things that we did, where we were looking now at the Facebook pages of mayors during the pandemic. And we were looking at the posts that the mayors were putting out, and then the comments of the people that supposedly lived within their local governments. And what we did was essentially we lumped together the posts and comments and tried to do this whole clustering exercise. And we found these 5 big clusters, right? So one was about relief allocation, another one was about cash disbursement, another about mass testing, and then the fourth about local quarantine. The 5th one I'm not really going to talk about because it was mainly just thank you to the nurses and the frontliners especially. So just looking at these 5 clusters, quantitatively you can already see that the leaders in the communities were talking about it in very different ways, right? So the leaders wanted to emphasize, hey, we're testing a lot, but the communities were like, where is our relief? Where is our cash? And what's going on with how you're implementing the lockdown locally, right? So that's what was happening quantitatively, and we were interested in qualitatively also. How are the mayors and the followers talking about it differently? So when we started, actually looking at the posts and actually looking at the comments, what we were seeing was that for the mayor, in terms of relief allocation, it was a split between equity and equality. So the mayors were saying, we need to prioritize relief distribution to those households who have none over those that can sustain themselves. Whereas the followers were saying, giving relief should not prioritize any household because everyone is affected by COVID-19. So the mayors were actually forwarding this policy of equity, right? And in fact, it sounds like equity, but really what they meant was we need to allocate our resources in an optimal way, right? Like let's just target the ones who need it the most. But the people on Facebook and the people with these communities were saying, no, everyone is affected, so do not do this whole targeting thing. Here, in terms of cash disbursement, there was a recurring pattern that we found where the mayors were just assuring that, yeah, it's being dispersed here, it's being dispersed there, whereas the followers were saying, actually, it's not being dispersed. Where is it happening? When is it going to arrive? So we were seeing that big discrepancy in terms of they're talking about the same thing, but one is trying to express assurance, the other one, the followers are trying to claim, no, it's super ambiguous. I don't feel assured at all. This third one I thought was really, really interesting because it was the major topic that was invoked by the mayors. And they were saying, essentially,
that we are doing a lot of testing, and actually that's the reason why we're seeing more numbers of infections being reported. So they were trying to basically reverse the logic. But anyway, if you look at what the followers are saying, they're saying actually we're not testing enough, and that's why the patients are increasing, right? So they're all using the same words: reports, testing, patients, and confirmation. But for the mayors, they're saying the fact that the number is rising is a testament to how well we're doing our jobs. Whereas the followers are saying, no, you're not doing your jobs well enough. We need to be testing more so that we can detect them earlier, and so that the infection won't spread as much. Okay. And then this final one that I wanted to mention is that the mayors are saying you have to follow the wearing of masks and don't allow the lawbreakers to go out. Whereas the followers are saying, well, you're telling us to do this, but you guys are the ones who are not enforcing the law. And you need to be you need to be capturing them and actually doing your job. Right. So essentially, when we saw those recurring patterns among 4 clusters, the way that we sort of synthesized this, the qualitative analysis was that for the leaders, the whole thing that they were doing was claiming responsiveness, that we are addressing our people's needs. We're doing all we can to follow centralized guidance from the National Health Ministry. And the problems only arise because of the followers who do not obey. Meanwhile, for the followers, it's about demanding responsibility. And they're saying, you are not addressing our need. You are not following your actual constituents. You're following the national guidance, but you're not listening to our actual problems. You're not seeing what's actually happening on the ground. And the problems arise from leaders who do not listen. Okay. So a few more things that I want to talk about before we dive into the coding. Besides examples of the studies, I wanted to talk about a little bit of how it can be really strange terrain when we're doing clustering methods, precisely because there's a lot more subjectivity that's baked into it. And I had a few notes here also about maybe extending the methods with certain technological advances. So even within the computing world, there have been attempts to sort of manage, quote unquote, manage the labeling process, right? So quantitatively, you arrive at these clusters, and then it's just an open-ended process of, people trying to identify what those clusters are. So what are we supposed to do to kind of assess the validity of those clusters? Some people will fall back on maybe more qualitative standards, like does it actually match the data? If you talk to someone that's really part of the community, does it resonate with their experience? But there also have been these sorts of quantitative attempts to assess validity. For example, here were 2 data sets where we performed this sort of clustering analysis. And what we did was, so for example, the model will break up the data into these here. It was broken up into 5 clusters. And within our team, we were analyzing the data. We identified these 5 different labels for the clusters. So here we were looking at a data set about EDSA, or the Democratic Transition Dictatorship in the 80s. So EDSA as a failure of the system, EDSA as a military-backed operation, EDSA as an inspiration for people in the present, EDSA as individual failures, and EDSA as collective action. So those are the five labels that we assigned to the clusters. And then what we did was, okay, let's write up an explanation of why that's our label. And then let's tell a bunch of research assistants, okay, here are the 5 clusters that we found, and here's why we labeled it that way. And then we would give them a random sample of texts from the data set and say, okay, given the labels that we just explained, which ones do you think which texts do you think go to which labels? So essentially, we were asking the human annotators to kind of, compete with the computational model. Are we going to see the same thing? And that's a way of kind of assessing whether our interpretative explanation intuitively makes sense. Are they going to see it? So in general, as you can see, the brighter squares here, those are the ones with the higher agreement. And so we were finding, okay, generally on the main diagonal, there's the highest agreement here, highest agreement here, 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 and here. So at least for the EDSA case, we were seeing, all right, there seems to be when we explain what those labels are and we give the data to human annotators, they're also seeing generally the same things, right? When we tried to do the same with a different data set, you're seeing a totally different story. What was this? I think this was in terms of, I think it was also EDSA again, of whether it was about unfulfilled promises, justice and reparation, cultural symbols. And you're seeing, okay, generally, if it's about cultural symbols, I think that was the easiest one for human annotators to get, because as long as this text like talked about plays or music, like, okay, I think this is about cultural symbols. But then these two are all kind of scrambled up, right? So if it was about justice and reparation or unfulfilled promises, people were starting to see one in the other category. And so this was how we knew, okay, maybe this one wasn't really, it might have made sense to us, but if we start asking our students, they're not really seeing the distinction as well. So at least between these two, this seems to be the one that people are understanding more intuitively, and you might think maybe this one is like the slightly better interpretation of what the clusters are. I'm not saying that you should be doing this all the time. In fact, we don't always do this, but this is something that we wanted to explore. Right? This is another way of quantifying that. Another thing that we tried to do was, because the models also tell us how certain they are, so they have a measurement of confidence. We were also seeing that, at least for the one on top, this one with the 5 labels, we were seeing that as the model grew more confident and the human also grew more confident, that was increasing the chance that the annotations would match. So this was also our way of not just seeing how much are they agreeing in terms of the final decision, but we actually asked them also, okay, what label do you think this is, and can you rate your confidence? And so we were seeing that also the amount of confidence was scaling in the way that we were expecting. So this allowed us to have a more holistic understanding of the agreement between the machine and people, right? So we didn't want to just focus on the final answer because even the model is not always sure. And so at least when the model was sure and the person was sure, their certainty or their confidence tended to have some grounding, right? In a different project, we also tried this thing where our clusters were also formed with some information about sort of a target variable that we were interested in. So here I was looking at a bunch of texts where we expected to see some hate speech. And so the formation of the clusters was sort of guided by that. I won't really go into the maths of this. But essentially what we were finding was that the model did, as appropriate, really did find clusters where some hate levels were higher and some were lower. Okay, I'm going to skip over this. But this is what we found, right? So we saw that these were the clusters that were in that hate speech corpus. There was one that was a lot of degrading gender terms. Another one where there was a lot of racially charged and white supremacist terms. Another one where it was more about this sort of sexually violent stuff. And here there was more anti-feminist and anti-progressive movement. So what we wanted to try out in this study, what I want to emphasize here is less the result itself and more this. so like I mentioned in previous parts of my talks, right? Our use of LLMs is still kind of in the early stages, and we're not really sure how it might fit into our ontological and epistemological commitments. But what we tried to do was, okay, because this is hateful text, this is not really something that I want to ask my undergrads to necessarily spend hours looking at. So what we wanted to try was to do exactly the same task that I explained earlier, where I would show a certain language model, a certain set of texts, and I would also tell it the menu of themes that we had already identified, and then try to see whether they would see the same things, right? So generally, the large language model was able to see the same sorts of labels that we had derived. And what's really, really unique to the large language model, and Simon did touch on this a little bit, is that for both the accurate and inaccurate classifications, it's also able to generate explanations. And so when, for instance, we thought, okay, this particular text is an instance of degrading misogyny, and GPT would also say, see the same thing, it would then explain why it saw that theme there. So here, the use of this derogatory term to insult and demean women aligns with degrading misogyny, as it perpetuates negative attitudes and stereotypes about women. Additionally, the use of the term could be seen as an attempt to undermine and dismiss the woman being addressed. Meanwhile, in the second instance here, which is white supremacy and xenophobia, the text perpetuates historical inaccuracies and promotes racist ideas, including referring to African Americans using racial slurs. It also attempts to downplay the historical role of white people in slavery while promoting anti-Indigenous and anti-Black sentiment. So this was something that is not really something you can practically ask of, let's say, human research assistants, right? So for every single text that we were asking an LLM to sort of validate, we were also asking, can you also produce like a 2 to 3 sentence explanation of why you think this thing belongs to that label, right? And so in a way, this was helping us better understand what the LLM was seeing in order to make its judgments. But it was also expanding our idea of, okay, what in this theme seems to be visible within the language. And then the really interesting thing here was when we would also take a look at the reasoning it was giving for when it would give us the wrong answer. And so that could also help us see under what circumstances two labels might be kind of mistaken for each other. So for instance, here, this one was thinking it belonged to topic 4, but in fact we had clustered it under topic 1. And so it actually shows that there's this sort of ambiguity between those two topics because, you know, it is mentioning this whole liberal hypocrisy and trailer trash, this word. And so the interesting thing here is that at least in being able to generate these explanations, even for the times it was doing a misclassification, it also kind of reveals some insight into the ambiguities categories. Okay. So yeah, so that was me talking for a while. Can we maybe pause for a few questions, if there are any, before we move on to the hands-on part of this? Maybe the questions will come in more once we actually start attempting to do all this. Maybe something I want to note is that unlike the classification models, right, it's a fairly straightforward pipeline. Like you have the label data, you train the model, you look at the words that are explaining the predictions, and then you have something to work with. As we will start to see in the demo, clustering is much more like messy. And so hopefully we can see what we can derive from that, from engaging with that mess. But yeah, so just like before, if you haven't already scanned or used this, if you haven't already clicked on the link, please try to do so. It will lead you to exactly the same folder. So if you already looked at the link from before, it's just the same one. So you can go ahead and create a copy of the clustering code this time. Here. And then this time, I'd like to request that you download this one, COVID UKPH. So this time, I'll just put this in the desktop. And put it up here in the folder like before. We'll upload COVID. Okay. Last time we did more of a break before moving on to this part, but I just wanna get here first because I think this first block might take a while. So just if you can already, please try to run the first block. Then we can pause a little bit. Yes, we're using the COVID file this time. So yeah, I think this first block, when I tried it out this morning,
was taking like maybe 2 minutes. So we'll just start there, and then once you get to the point where you can hit run, we'll pause for a bit. That's okay. Just want to check. Are you able to run it? So good. You good here? No. Okay, that's fine.
I've copied it. I have
Okay.
done nothing with it. No, this is the wrong one.
Oh, that's the classification.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah. No problem. Oh, you get run. Okay. Yeah. So I think
The cluster.
clustering this time. Yes.
Wow.
So it's taking a little bit longer because the library that it uses is quite a bit heavier, I think. Yeah, usually if you're running things online out of your own machine and not out of the browser, you download it once and it's all good. But here it seems to have to do it every time.
Not able to download the COVID file or something.
Oh,
No, no, I can't.
okay.
Sorry.
No. Yes, actually it is. I do admit it's a little bit more alien this time.
What does it mean when it says the object is masked?
Oh, that's okay. It's just it's still within the line, but it's like nothing. I explain this, but it's okay. Bottom line, it's fine.
Also done.
Okay, nice. All right. So we're just gonna walk through the same process as before. So if you're done with the installation, you can go ahead and play on the file reading part, and then the data cleaning part. So yeah. So this time actually, the data set is a bunch of speeches that were given during COVID, and some of the speeches are from the UK and others are from the Philippines. So I thought, okay, let's put the data set together for this. So I'm not too sure what the results look like because I've never dealt with this particular slice of the data. But yeah, so if we run through all of the code, let's convert to a document term matrix. This time you're seeing like a slightly less sparse matrix now. Then let's run all the way up to this block that says create this one, squared frequency thing. Okay.
With the file name device one, it says in the
Okay. Were you able to upload it already?
yeah.
Oh. I think when you saved it, it was as an Excel sheet. So it should be saved as a CSV file. Yeah, so here it is not XLSX. Yeah, so would you go to do that? So it's save it. This.
Mine won't let me do the try many thing. This one here,
Mm.
saying error.
Oh no. Okay. Yeah, well, we won't start there yet, but so sorry. I think when I was moving the files around, there ended up being like a one row where it's totally blank. So what I would like everybody to copy, I'll paste this to the chat so you can,
Perfect.
yeah. Right here. So you can just copy that over the fit df line, so under the try menu. And then everything should run from there. So you can hit play over there already, but let's maybe take a look here at this word frequency matrix. What you sort of notice, like you're seeing the top words are not very informative at first. Just, can, now. But you're starting to see people, government, country, COVID. Yeah, okay, those are things that would come out in a COVID speech. Money, virus, police. Yeah. What do you think? Is there anything interesting in this word frequency matrix?
Thank
is kind of low.
is kind of low, yeah. Yeah, secretary.
I was just thinking about the words of need and must. So like the kind of prescriptiveness maybe of the species potential.
Yeah, good. Needed must. Health, there's the NHS. Great. So there's actually like you can sort of get some suggestive things from the word frequency matrix, but I think you can't really go too far beyond that, right? So we tried to go a little bit deeper with this one here. If you can start hitting the run on this next block here, the try many, does it work now with the additional line?
Where do I put the line?
Just at the top.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, good. Thank you very much. Huh, so strange. Okay, good.
I think it's we feel like I know.
Yeah. Oh, right. I realize you're not on the. I'm so sorry. Are you? Is it good?
I know, I probably did something wrong.
Oh, that's good. Yeah. Have you? Shall we
Yeah,
try?
yeah.
Go for it. Hey, click it. Oh no, is it not working? Okay.
Oh,
Good.
good, thank you.
Okay, so one of the weird things, right, about clustering algorithms, or at least most of them, is that they don't know in advance how many clusters there are, right? In a way that can be a strength, in a way that can be a weakness. For a classification algorithm, you know exactly what the labels are, and you know how many labels there are. But for clustering, we don't know that. And so typically what ends up happening is you as the analyst, you have to be the one to tell it how many clusters there are. But then that begs the question, what number do you give, right? Where do you start? So one of the ways that this proceeds is that we really just try many, and then we take a look at different measures of how fit those clusters are to then decide, okay, we will stick with this number. So that has the sort of weird property of kind of being somewhat circular, right? Because it's like, I'm going to try running this algorithm many times, and then I will try to see which one has the best fit. And then from there, I will run it just using that one that appears to be the most fit. So if your try many code block is already done running, it should have produced this figure here. Did you get that?
Yeah, not quite.
Not quite.
Similar.
Did you get that?
Yeah.
Yeah, looks something like that. Yeah, it's not exactly the same though. Yeah, okay. So just like before, there's like a kind of elbow situation, right? Yeah, where does yours happen? 4 or 5?
6.
6. Okay. Yeah. Where's your elbow, you think?
Yeah, 5 to 6.
5 or 6. Okay, yeah. It's a slightly different figure for action. Well,
It could be different when we all have the same data.
we do all have the same data. So I don't know what's going on. I'm so sorry. Like this
No, that's fine, it's
Yeah.
interesting.
So this is okay, some people have 7 or 5. Yeah. So this model is somewhat probabilistic, and so the results can sometimes vary a little bit, which is why typically you ask it to do it multiple times. If this was like a research study where you would want a very good and stable answer, we would do it more than just once for each number of topics. So here, what we were doing was, okay, this is a data set of reasonable size. So maybe try 2 to 10 clusters, right? Like I'll try a model with 2 clusters, I'll try a model with 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 10, and then we'll take a look at the figure that comes out here. Okay. So for me at least, the elbow seems to be around 6. Could be also 7 if you like that. But yeah, at least across the 4, 5, or 6 of us, the range of the optimal number of topics seems to be 5, 6, or 7, right? So yeah, in a research study, you would probably do it another time, or maybe 3 or 4 times, and then take a look at all of the elbow graphs, and then find like on average, where are we kind of finding that elbow? So
Just a quick question. So
Yeah.
in this code, if we wanted to try with the set number of, or with change the number of clusters, what would we change in the code?
Okay, good. Yes. So over here, we were setting the range to be between 2 and 10.
Okay,
So if you want to try a different range, you can just fiddle with those numbers.
okay, thank you.
Yeah. And then from there, once you've picked a number, I guess for here, I will just pick 6. There, so you can just change what that K is. Maybe we can do 5. Since I think some of us have 5, some of us have 7. Yeah, I'll just do 5 for now. And that'll run it.
What's LDA?
So LDA is the name of the model that we're using. So earlier with the classification, we were doing decision trees and random forest models.
Yeah.
This one is LDA, so that stands for latent Dirichlet allocation.
Latent what?
Yeah.
Where did it-
Oops, I didn't type it.
Oh, there's a lag.
Yeah. So latent Dirichlet allocation. I tend not to say what it is because it turns people off. But the idea here is that the topics it's thinking about words as these sorts of outputs of probabilistic distribution. And that distribution is what's called a Dirichlet distribution. So if you have normal distributions that are like curves for like a continuous variable, they're thinking about language as this sort of probabilistic process of picking from a certain group of possible words. So anyway, that's the technical origin of it. You don't need to know that. You can forget it the moment you leave the room. But yes, LDA is a form of topic model. So topic model is usually what I say.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So if you run that block, actually we can all try our own if you want to do 5, if you want to do 6 or 7. But what will happen in the next block is it will show you the outputs of that LDA model you decided to estimate, right? One of the really cool things about LDA is that it will tell you what are the top words that are associated with each cluster. So this is totally done mathematically. So it's not, there's no interpretation yet, right? So I wonder what people have been getting. World, one country, government, global trade is what Fouad gets for number 1. Yeah, it looks like completely different.
Same to mine. Mine is like money, COVID, government. Yeah, no. My last one is country, world, government.
That's the one that's most like mine, right? Oh no, here, country.
Yeah,
world.
That's where 3.
Yeah.
Three would be more.
How about you?
Well, that's
Okay, so you have that one is your 5th.
Yeah.
Yeah. Who has the NHS in the first one? Virus NHS is like
That's
second,
my 4th one.
4th.
5th.
Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it doesn't matter really. Either.
Yeah. Well, so the thing is like the clusters don't inherently have a number, right? So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, they're not numbers per se. They're like a categorical variable in this case. So our so our sequence will look slightly different. So for Pallavi, that NHS virus is 4th. For Rakshi, it's 5th. But we all seem to have similar clusters, right? They're just in different orders. Okay.
Pallavi's also asking a good question. What about words which can have multiple meanings? Like I have the word really in cluster 1.
Yeah. So words with multiple meanings are treated the same, sadly, like in all of these methods, because there's no way to know just based on what a computer can see.
Okay.
Right. So you will be able to know, for instance, based on what are the words next to it.
Yeah.
So if so for example, there's one topic that's virus, that's like mask and vaccine, but another topic has virus and let's say computers and whatever. then that's how you would be able to identify which words have different meanings.
Is the word dawn like don't cut
Yeah.
short?
Yeah, it's don't cut short.
Sorry, these are very basic questions, but
No. They're very important to ask because sometimes I like gloss over them because they're like, yeah, there's something I deal with all the time. So if you ask, I'll know what I should be explaining. Yes, so thank you. Yes, so exactly, Palavi. Like if it occurs across multiple clusters, you definitely look at what are the words next to it. Yeah.
I mean, all computational methods have an issue with polysemia.
Yep. Yeah.
Like it's multiple meanings thing.
Mhm.
Even AI's
The
timeless.
synonyms, yeah. So yeah, that's an inherent limitation of all these methods, and which is why really we don't stop there, at least for our purposes. Okay. Good. So based now on this, based on these topics, what can we sort of start to maybe infer? Maybe let's look at the one that has like the NHS and virus on it. So for me, that's topic 2. What are the other words there? So I have virus, think, measures, NHS, first country, right, peak, social. What do you think is happening in those speeches?
maybe it's more focused on the kind of health advice of it, like, you know, explaining the virus, how maybe you identify it, how you address it, you know, what services are provided, whatever.
Technocratic public health.
Yep.
In my label.
Yeah.
Much better than what I said.
There's also this question of the peak as well, right? I think peak of maybe the COVID wave, I'm not so sure. Oh, do you have NHS with the word thank? Or because mine is think?
I have it with the word think, I think, as well.
Oh.
Thank, today, advice, right?
I see.
And think. So it has
And
both.
Okay. Maybe mine is just somewhere else.
I don't have thank.
Okay. Well, yeah. So if you're having some kind of thank the NHS, so Rakshi Palabi. Okay. So my sense is because I have this thing that's intended to set the scene. So supposedly that was going to deal with all of the randomness of the model, which it did do for the random forest. There may be slight differences in machines that are giving it different scenes. Anyway, yeah, there's that call to thank the doctors and the NHS. Very nice. That could very well be a part of it. So maybe there's that convergence of the technocratic thing with the gratitude. Maybe I'm making that connection more than the model, maybe. But we will see. In the next text block, we're gonna probe the documents this time. But maybe let's take a look at another part of this sort of set of lists. This one. Oh no, this is where my thank NHS is. So home, NHS, disease, thank country, need, world, get lives, everyone.
NHS is in multiple places.
Yeah. I'm so sorry, yes.
So
Okay.
that's why. Okay.
So there's this one. Yeah. Home, NHS, disease, thank, get lives, lives.
So is thank.
Yeah. Yes, Pallavi. Just like as we were saying earlier, this one is much more messy. It's much more messy than the classification models, right? And for some that can be a weakness, and for others it can be a strength. Yeah. This first one, for me at least, is where money and police and COVID problem is. Oh, okay. The probe got an error. I think it might be the same error as before. Can you all try the last block if it works? Yeah, I have an error also. Yes, Pallavi, yeah, it's an opportunity to see variability. I think can I pause it again? Let me try to address that error. I think it's connected. All right. So like before, it would be this line at the beginning after probe documents. Sorry, Sandra, do you want my help to type it up?
No, that's okay. I will,
Okay.
data.
It's okay.
Now we're working? Okay, good, good. Oh, good. Okay. Then when you try to run it, let's see, just hit run. It should produce this my reading.csv file next to your original COVID file. And this is intended for probing the documents, really. So what ends up happening here is it's going to give you the top 3 texts for each of the topics. And you'll actually find that somewhat as one might expect, the topics actually split up by country. So it seems that the topics are not really within, between countries commonly. But like, let's say, of course, if it's the NHS, then the Philippine speeches are not really going to talk about it, right? So
Some are in common.
some are in common for you?
Topic 3 is in UK.
Oh, good, good. Yeah. Let's see. Topic 3.
I have only split by country. 1 is Philippines, 2 and 3, and 4 and 5 are UK.
Mm. Yeah, but these results are so different. Okay. Yeah, mine is also still country split. I wonder what's going on there. What's your share?
Several actually.
Oh, all of them?
Philippines, one UK, yeah.
Okay.
You don't have any UK?
I've been spending for a while to have got to the UK.
Okay. Malawi has 2 UK. Yeah. Okay. There are a total of so Malawi, there should just be 1 file that comes out. It's my reading. Yeah, but there should be a total of 15 speeches. Yeah, 15 entries. So 5 topics, 3 entries each.
Even with this, reading all the way through each
Yeah.
one.
Yeah. So here, I guess the point I want to make here, right, is in the classification models, what we were seeing was the quantitative stuff is giving us a lot more to work with, right? Like you're given numbers associated with the words, you're given an accuracy level. Here, this is just saying, here is how a mathematical model would look at this entire data set and split them up into meaningful segments. So the real work happens here. So this is usually why these are the kinds of methods that when I'm working with a lot more qual people, I'm the one that produces this. And then at most, I will also show the list of words here as a sort of set of guideposts like this. And then we will kind of split up and then do the independent coding thing and then try to read into what are the actual meaning-making processes that are going on within the clusters, right? I think it was a little ambitious that that I wanted to do that here. But generally, what we would end up trying to do is we would all try to interpret these texts, right? So for example, here, in this, let's say, yeah, here, in this relief allocation, this was all one topic. And what we did was we generated those examples for the mayor talk and for the follower talk. And the way that we tried to label what was going on the exercise that we would do, which would incorporate both the model outputs and our own interpretation, is that we would try to create this unified storyline that would use those words. So if this topic was defined by the terms ayuda, relief, tulong, bahay, and wala, so here that means this is a specific kind of aid that we do in the Philippines, ayuda, relief, tulong means help, bahay means house, and wala means it doesn't exist, right? So what we would try to do was, okay, everybody read the texts that are being clustered within this category, and then try to interpret what's going on. And then when we come together to interpret like maybe the theme or the discourse or whatever, we would try to say it in the terms of the words that are there. So they're kind of acting as a sort of quantitative like constraints on the way that we do our interpretation. So yeah,
There's supposed to be 3 1s, 3 2s.
yeah,
For each country, right?
yeah, here.
Yeah.
Yeah, those should be they're just numbers for the topics.
Because you specified to give you 3 samples.
Yeah, yeah. So if you want to change that, you can change like how many documents you want to be printed out. So here I just wanted to do 3.
Is it like integrator coding? But you were saying after you've structured.
Oh yeah. Well, yeah. Iterator coding, not quite in the sense of like getting a kappa or an alpha coefficient, but when we're doing qualitative analysis, we usually start with that process of iteratively reading a transcript and identifying codes somewhat independently. Yes, as in qualitative work. Exactly. Yeah, yeah. So all that the data is doing is, all that the model is doing is saying, here are the patterns of words which tend to co-occur with each other. And I'm going to divide up the data set like that. And then I will not tell you what it means, right? It doesn't actually give us an interpretative label because that's not the job of the model, right? Instead, what it will tell us is just quantitatively, here is where the data seems to split up into these 5 different parts. And then the job of the person that's doing the analysis would then be to read through those texts, read through the top words, which were quantitatively identified to be the top in those texts, and then try to identify what's going on.
So if we follow the logic of the previous approach, so classification, we could have used country as a classifier of text.
Yeah. Yes.
And if we ran the same thing here, we would get country as a classifier of text, at least for me, because there was no overlap.
Yeah.
Is there any benefit in using, or I don't know if there's any kind of moral rules around this, but like, would you in any project use both classification and clustering of the same data set, or is there a rationale maybe for using one rather than the other, or a rationale for not using both?
That's a very good question. So it depends on what your research question is, right? Because it'll match with what the model is trying to do. If we were to use the classification code, what you would end up finding out from the outputs is what are the words used differently between the UK and the Philippines, right? And sometimes that's not your question, right? So if it is about the difference, then you would use the classification model. What this clustering was intended to do, at least, was to find out what are the patterns of talk within all of the speeches. And then maybe you would find that there's one topic that actually both countries are using. And then there are others that are maybe more country specific.
So for example, my number ones, just looking briefly, seem to be very much related to international relations and trade and market and everything to do with like the global.
And it had both the UK and the Philippines. Yeah. Yes, definitely, Rakshi. It's more exploratory. You can actually think of the labels as a kind of constraint, right? In the classification modeling section of this workshop, like you're giving the models a little bit more information to work with, and then you try to find the insights based on those constraints. Here, you're literally just giving it the text, right? The model actually is not fed the UK or the Philippines as a field of the data. It's really just the text. And so what the model attempts to do is then just see, which words tend to be used together a lot. So it seems that there's one where it's about thanking the NHS, and there's this one that might be doing a lot of international relations work. And so supposedly that is something that a quantitative model would be able to perceive, but it's then up to the person doing the interpretation to identify what are those splits in reference to.
So is there like computationally or methodologically an issue with doing a cluster analysis, doing a qualitative segment where you come up with labels for those clusters, and then running a classifier to validate those, the fit of those labels on data, that data or other data that's similar?
Yeah, well, that's actually something that some people have done in their research. So you would, so the somewhat sort of circular issue there is that the clustering only identifies something like a probabilistic label for each of the texts, whereas in a supervised or in a classification setting, it's a sure label, right? Like this one is for sure a pro, and this one is for sure an anti, for something like that, or this one is for sure from a post-colonial setting or a post-imperial setting. So in a classification setup, the labels are assumed to be like fixed and true, right? Whereas if you were to do clustering and then a classification, the clusters might be somewhat mixed. So there might be like a text that is 50% this and 50% that.
Yeah, but like I'm thinking of it in terms of, okay, you get these clusters and then you do the qualitative work that tells you, oh, this is what the discourse really is about in each of these clusters.
Yeah.
And then so you can focus on very specific things or on a particular idea or something, and ask your classifier to label the corpus on that specific basis. So that, it's not actually recursive. It's not the same thing.
Okay.
It's taking it forward on the basis of the exploratory data mining kind of initial step.
Yeah. So that can definitely be done. Yes.
I was gonna say that was kind of just having gone through it. That's kind of my reading of the clustering is like the qual work comes a little after in terms of understanding it, but then that can also then feed into developing new classification where the qual work comes before.
Yeah, and Simon was telling us actually there's several instances where you use ensembles of models to analyze stuff.
Yeah, well, in Simon's case, he was talking about ensembles of models doing the same thing, and then you would have them vote. So the idea would be that the wisdom of multiple models would exceed that of a single model. So I think what you're describing is in terms of a sequence of models rather than an ensemble doing the same thing.
Right. I was thinking also in terms of the way that, for example, LLMs or similar, like join, encoder, decoder. Like it's a sequential, sometimes like multiple things feeding into it. He was talking about how the reasoning AIs have all of these like other models being called in to sort of depending on the complexity of the prompt or something. That one gets called in if it's that, or that one gets called in if it's that.
Yeah.
So like these seems like there's a lot of there's quite a bit of the element of design involved as well in sort of your choices of where to put that computation and your analytic strategy.
Right. Yeah, lots of room for interplay between the models, especially if the kind of task that you want to achieve is something that isn't limited to just classification or just clustering. Yeah. So, for example, if there's a data set where you totally don't know what's going on, you might want to start with like a clustering thing. And then that tells you that, okay, there's a big chunk here that is about how we maybe react to institutions, right? Like thank the NHS or damn the NHS, right? And then you would create this taxonomy that you could then use to label the data and then train a classifier. Yep, absolutely. Yeah.
Super exciting.
Yeah. Maybe to think in terms of our specific project, right? Like if we're looking at news coverage of a certain country or like maybe there's a way to use these sorts of methods to inductively identify different kinds of political change, right? Rather than using inductively an existing taxonomy that may not apply to our context.
Although even then, I mean, you didn't really talk about the network models,
No, yeah.
but with that, like, we were talking about looking at edges and
Mhm.
things like that between like individuals, so
Right.
identifying those individuals and sort of coming up with proximities or links between them, looking at that over time
Yeah.
to sort of say, okay, network change equals
Certain
this kind of change.
Right. Yeah. Yes. Many
Okay.
possibilities.
I'm glad.
Yeah. Thank you, Rakshi. Who seems to want to say something? Yeah.
While she's typing, so the classification data we worked with was obviously kind of sentences, and this is full speeches.
Yes.
Is there a difference in what type of data is better for what kind of model?
Strictly speaking, no. There are maybe like when you hit the extremes, like it's much harder to do clustering if it's like 4 words,
Yeah.
right? But all of the models should work for any length of text. If it is a classification task, you may want to ensure that the categories that are your labels are not something that can get like mixed within, like say, let's say a speech, right?
Okay.
Like if a speech is like partly positive and then partly negative,
Yeah.
then the classifier will get
Exactly, yeah.
confused, right? Yeah. So that, yeah. And then if the texts are a little bit smaller, then maybe topics don't really make sense yet. Thank you so much to Pallavi. Those are such kind words. Yeah. I really did intend for this to be quote unquote newbie friendly.
It's really great.
Thank you so much. But yeah, personally, I really want to figure out why we had different outputs. So I think it had something to do with that correction and things just cascaded, but at least the classification worked as expected. This code should still work though for any text data that you have, and it only needs text data. So I would encourage you to just maybe try if you have your own like CSV file that has a bunch of text, see what comes out, and then get some practice with it. But as we try to emphasize, it's not a complete method because it will not actually tell you what the clusters mean. So it still requires a lot more engagement with the data. And how I wish we could do another workshop where it's just qual. Maybe.
Yeah, I'm open.
Yes, thank you so much as well, Alfaz.
All right, any other last questions? Okay, great. All right, thank you all so much. I'm just gonna put in some links in the text for our next session, which will be by Dr. Agnieszka Richwalska, who will present on how to use functional connectivity analysis, a form of network analytic approach that also is a little bit similar to these kinds of clustering approaches, to understand how complex coordination works in biological and social systems. So if you're interested, take a look at our schedule and registration links. They'll be posted on our website. If you haven't registered to our listserv, of course you can, or look at our site on the Existence Psychology Network. Thanks again for being here, and have a great day.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, everyone. It was fantastic.